She rose before the first light touched the edge of the eastern dunes, when the stars still held dominion over the slumbering city. Her body stirred not from rest, but from necessity, a silent command etched into the fibers of her limbs. She sat for a long moment on the edge of her thin reed mat, listening to the soft breath of the world still asleep. Her small room, little more than a clay-walled corner behind the beerhouse, held the scent of sweat, sandalwood, and silence. A breeze whispered through the slit window, and she knew it was time. She reached for the single linen wrap folded beside her, its fabric worn thin from years of washing and dust. As she stood, the coolness of the floor beneath her bare feet grounded her. With slow movements, she wound the cloth around her body, tucking it beneath her arm with a quiet elegance that only repetition could perfect. There was no mirror here, only a polished copper shard she kept hidden under a broken pot. She looked into it briefly, seeing not her beauty, but her survival. In a corner, her jar of scented oil awaited. She opened it gently, releasing a smell of crushed lotus and desert myrrh luxuries in another life, tools in this one. With her fingers, she dabbed a bit behind her ears, at her wrists, and between her breasts. The scent was not for herself. It was armor, allure, and offering. There was no time for hesitation. She slipped out quietly, past the snoring breath of the beerhouse's owner, down the narrow alley where shadows still clung like ghosts. Outside, the world was washed in darkness, tinged with indigo. The sand made no sound beneath her feet. Her footsteps were as familiar to the earth as any priest's in procession. She passed shuttered market stalls, their awnings sagging like tired shoulders. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, a baby cried and was hushed. But the city was mostly asleep, as if held in the final breath before awakening. Only she moved with purpose through this sacred pause. At the corner of the avenue, she paused, to tie a strand of red thread around her wrist. Hathor's color, protection or pretense. It had frayed over time, like her soul, but she still believed in its power, or at least, she pretended to. In the coolness of the early hour, she pulled her shawl tighter. Not from cold, but from memory of nights where her skin was not hers, and mornings where she pretended it had always belonged only to her. She followed the same path each morning, from the low quarters near the beerhouse to the quieter streets where wealth stirred slowly. The perfume sellers were not yet awake, but she passed their shops, inhaling the lingering scent of cedar and rose oil. Above her, balconies stood empty, linen fluttering like the tongues of forgotten gods. She thought of them often, those stone-faced deities carved into walls, so indifferent, so eternal. While she faded one sunrise at a time. By the banks of the Nile, the mist curled like incense. The water, still and deep, mirrored the stars that had not yet yielded to day. She often stopped here, not to pray, not anymore, but to remember who she had once been. A girl who had watched her mother gather reeds. A girl who'd once danced barefoot by this same riverbank, pretending the world was hers. Now, she merely stood and watched the reflection of a stranger she called herself. A fisherman passed her, nodding without words. He knew her, not her name, but her pattern. He had seen her walk this path for years, always alone. He never spoke. She never asked why. In silence, they shared a fragile understanding that the early hours belonged to those who had no place in daylight. She resumed her walk as he cast his net, both of them ensnaring what they needed to survive. She reached a low wall carved with faded hieroglyphs. This was her place, her temple. Here, she waited, not for a lover, not for salvation, but for what the morning might bring. Some days, a wealthy client would arrive early, veiled and nervous. Other times, no one came, and she would sit for hours, counting the cracks in the sandstone. Every mark felt familiar now, like wrinkles in her own skin. A small boy once gave her a fig from his basket here. She never asked why. She had taken it, thanked him softly, and watched him run off, barefoot and grinning. That fig had tasted sweeter than any lover's kiss, and for a moment, as the juice had spilled onto her tongue, she remembered how joy once felt. Fleeting, unexpected, undeserved, but real. She never saw him again. Only the memory remained. Birds began to stir in the trees lining the canal. Their song, soft at first, slowly rose into a chorus of waking life. The air warmed slightly, the stars faded, the gods retreated, and she, too, shifted in posture from waiting to working. She adjusted her shawl, her gaze sharpened. Her body, though aching, stood tall. There was no room for fatigue in this profession, only performance. A chariot rumbled by in the distance, wheels crunching gravel. A man called to her once, and she turned with a smile practiced over years, revealing neither hunger nor hope. He didn't stop. She watched him vanish into the horizon, leaving dust in his wake. She brushed it from her arm without emotion, as if brushing away a broken promise too old to mourn. When the sun finally crested over the dunes, it lit her face in gold, not like a blessing, but like a brand. The light did not make her radiant, made her visible. That was dangerous. Visibility meant vulnerability. So she shifted again, stepping into the shadows of a nearby awning, watching the world awaken. She did not greet the dawn like the priests did. She endured it by now. The first vendors were lifting their shutters, groaning at the weight of the day. The bread maker tossed flour onto his table. The butcher swept yesterday's blood from the stones. Life resumed, loud and indifferent, and in the corners of this chaos, she remained part of the scenery, yet invisible. Her existence was known but never spoken of. She was an unacknowledged detail in the story of the street. A woman passed her, clutching a child. Their eyes met briefly, no words exchanged, but the woman looked away quickly, as if guilt could be caught like a fever. The child, however, stared, innocent, curious, unjudging. That stare lingered in her memory long after they disappeared. She wondered what that girl would grow into, and whether her path, too, would someday wind through these quiet, cruel alleys. The sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows. She shifted her weight from one foot to another. Hunger tugged at her belly. Her hands fidgeted at the hem of her linen. A man approached hesitant, alone. She saw his eyes avoid hers. That was how they often clashed, but shame did not pay. She stepped forward, not like a seductress, but like a survivor. A transaction began, and the morning transformed. Later, she would wash her hands in a basin of rosewater, not to feel clean, but to feel removed. She would whisper to herself the names of goddesses she no longer believed in, asking for peace she knew would never arrive. But in this moment, at the start of yet another day, she walked forward step by silent step, to the heat of survival. Every morning was like this, a quiet resurrection, a journey through shadow into light. Not glorious, not tragic, simply lived, and in that living, a history forgotten by scribes, ignored by priests, but remembered by the stones beneath her feet. She was not a heroine, not a villain, not a priestess, nor a queen, but she was real. And in the hour before sunrise, when the world was quietest, she belonged to herself, if only for a heartbeat. Then the day took her again. Asterisk. She no longer knelt at the temple gates. The priests had passed her too many times without blessing, their eyes fixed on scrolls instead of sorrow. In another lifetime, perhaps she might have stood among them, offering incense in reverence. But now, her incense came from small clay jars with chipped lids, hidden in the folds of a woven mat. Her prayers had grown silent, replaced by rituals of survival, rituals that smelled of myrrh, of blue lotus, of sweat masked in jasmine. Each morning, she unscrewed the lid of her perfume jar, as if unsealing a sacred tomb. The scent rose slowly, curling through the air like memory itself. Myrrh, thick and resinous, stuck to her fingers like promises once whispered. She rubbed it into her wrists, the motion slow, careful, deliberate. It was not just scent, it was shielding. The world might not worship her, but the scent made her powerful, invisible and known, feared and desired in equal measure. There was a small line of vials she kept tucked behind a cracked brick in the corner of her room. One for allure, one for protection, one for sleep. She believed, or pretended to believe, that certain oils warded off sickness, or softened a man's temper, or ensured he forgot her face before the morning. These were her gods now, and they listened with scent, not scripture. The women she shared quarters with followed the same rites. No one spoke of it, but all knew. In the quiet hours, the clink of stopper against jar became a kind of chorus, a hymn without melody. No temple bell rang here, but still, they prepared, like priestesses of flesh and perfume, cloaked in oils, more ancient than the stones lining the Pharaoh's causeway. One vial in particular she guarded with care. It had once belonged to her mother, passed down like an heirloom, though its contents were humble. It contained crushed lilies and a hint of spikenard. The scent reminded her of childhood, of a time before the city's dust clung to her soul. When she uncorked it, just briefly, She wasn't a harlot, she was a daughter again, barefoot in the fields, untouched by the eyes of men. She had long since learned the balance between too much and too little. Too much perfume marked her desperate, overwhelming. Too little, and she vanished into the city's faceless crowds. The sweet spot, just enough to draw attention, not enough to cheapen mystery, was an art form. It was her secret magic, more potent than any spell inked in papyrus. There were men who remembered her by scent alone. A soldier once told her that her arrival felt like the first breeze after war warm, sudden, needed. He did not remember her name, but he remembered the way she smelled of cinnamon and river clay. That was enough. Names faded, fragrance lingered. A woman could vanish, but her scent might haunt the halls of a man's memory forever. She sometimes thought the gods must be jealous. How often did worshippers fall to their knees in devotion and forget the scent of the temple floor? But the men who came to her remembered. They could not pray without recalling her, whether they wanted to or not. And perhaps that, in its own quiet way, made her divine. There were cheaper scents, those made of rancid oil mixed with soot. Many poor women used them, rubbing whatever they could find into their skin. But she refused. Even in hunger, she chose only oils she trusted. She believed it wasn't just for men. It was for herself, her armor, her illusion. The difference between surrender and survival. When she walked through the city, the scent preceded her like a herald. Children turned their heads. Vendors leaned. From stalls, even temple guards, hardened by long hours under sun and stone, lifted their eyes. No words needed to pass. The scent spoke for her. It said, "I am more than the linen I wear. I am more than the silver you carry. I am a story you cannot forget." There was a ritual before each encounter. She never rushed it. She would uncork the small vial, inhale deeply, and press a finger to her neck. Always the neck. Just there, where a man's hand might linger after passion or before cruelty. The scent stayed there longest. The neck was memory's favorite place. She believed in the power of oil more than she believed in fate. Perfume was a choice, even when the world offered her none. When she was 16, a priest told her that fate was carved in stars. But stars did not protect her from fists or fever. Oils did. When she lay with strangers, their faces shadowed by wine or shame, the only thing she could claim as her own was how she smelled. There was a night she ran out of perfume. Her fingers scraped the bottom of the jar and found nothing. Panic welled inside her like floodwater. She felt naked, not without clothing, but without power. That night, the man who visited her was rougher, colder. She wept silently after, not from pain, but from the absence of her invisible shield. She swore it would never happen again. Sometimes, after the men had left and the room returned to silence, she would light a small piece of frankincense and let it burn in a broken bowl. Not for the gods, for herself. To cleanse the air, to remind herself that she was still here. The scent spiraled upward like a ghost, weaving through the rafters, dancing with dust, and she watched it, eyes heavy, feeling less alone. The perfumes reminded her of stories. She often imagined herself as a character in a scroll, perhaps a queen who used lotus to seduce enemies, or a spy who wore jasmine to pass unseen. She made myths of herself, because reality was too small. In scent, she was vast, limitless, unwritten. There were men who brought her gifts, rare oils from the south, expensive incense wrapped in cloth. She accepted them, but trusted none. Their gifts were traps, like sweet dates hiding poison. She preferred her own collection, simple, earned, familiar. Even the broken jars had names in her mind. They were her companions, her guardians. A woman once accused her of sorcery. "You cast spells on men," the woman hissed. She smiled in reply. "I only use perfume." But in truth, there was something magical in it. Not witchcraft, transformation. Oil on the skin became confidence in the heart. Scent became a mask, and behind it, she became whatever she needed to be. There was a perfume she used only for herself. Not during work, not before visitors. It was warm, woody, bittersweet, like dates soaked in time. She wore it before bed, when the world went quiet, and she lay curled like a question mark on her mat. That scent was for dreaming, for remembering, for forgetting years past, and some of the vials emptied, never to be refilled. She lined them up like little tombstones along her shelf. Each had a story, a season, a man, a pain. She sometimes touched them gently, as if touching the shoulder of an old friend, They held her history better than any scroll. She didn't believe the gods listened anymore, but the oils did. They clung to her skin, soaked into her memory, followed her like shadows made of scent. They didn't judge. They didn't forget. And when she died, she hoped they would linger in the air above her grave, so anyone might inhale and remember the woman who once prayed with perfume. The mirror was not glass but copper, burnished over time by fingers now calloused. It did not reflect beauty as it once might have, but memory warped and tinged with rust. She pulled it from beneath a folded linen, hidden behind jars and bowls, as if it were a secret. In truth, it was a relic from another life. When she held it up, her face stared back, not with hope, but with resignation. She no longer examined for flaws. She looked only to remember what the world had taken. The mirror had been her mother's once, a wedding gift from a father whose face she no longer recalled. Her mother had polished it each morning with fresh linen, humming while she did so. As a child, she had watched in awe, thinking the mirror was magic. Now, older, she knew the truth. It had always lied. It showed what she wanted to see, not what was real. And some days, she preferred that dot each morning before the sun spilled over the rooftops. She would sit cross-legged before the mirror. The silence of that ritual was sacred, though no god witnessed it. She'd unwrap her linen, bare her shoulders, and examine herself, not in vanity but in acknowledgement. A ritual of inventory. New bruises, faint scars. The slope of her collarbone, once praised, now hidden beneath exhaustion. There was no joy in it anymore, only necessity. In the mirror, she gauged how to sell the illusion. Should she smile with her eyes today, or keep them distant and unreachable? Should she rouge her lips like the temple girls once did, or remain pale, letting sorrow wear its own paint? These choices were strategies, not expressions. Tools, not decorations. Sometimes she would see her mother's face in the reflection, not entirely, just the eyes, or the curve of the cheek. And in those moments, she would pause, hand hovering over her own jawline. A memory would rise, a laugh, a song, a scolding, and then it would fade. The mirror offered no mercy. It remembered what she tried to forget. She used charcoal to darken her eyes. The line had to be steady. Any tremble betrayed more than sleeplessness. It showed fear. She couldn't afford that. With the mirror propped against a bowl, she traced the coal carefully. It was always the same pattern, bold above, tapered below. Seduction outlined like geometry. The illusion of power drawn in black dot. The powder for her cheeks came from crushed ochre, mixed with old oil. She dabbed it on with her fingers, rubbing it gently into the skin. The motion was rhythmic, calming. It reminded her of grinding grain. As a girl, when life had yet to bend her spine. Now, she ground pigment into her own face, trying to erase what time and men had carved into it. She didn't speak as she painted. Words had no place in this sanctuary. The mirror could not answer questions. It only returned silence. And yet, she whispered things sometimes. Not prayers, never again, but soft promises. Today will be gentle. He won't be cruel. I'll survive the night. The mirror did not reply, but she kept whispering anyway. Once, she dropped the mirror. It cracked down the side, a long scar from corner to center. She'd cried not for the damage, but because it felt like confirmation. Her reflection was now split in two. One side fierce, painted, ready, the other raw, vulnerable, exposed. She still used it, maybe even more now. The crack reminded her that no mask was seamless. On certain mornings, after heavy nights, she would not sit before the mirror at all. Instead, she would roll over and bury her face into the mat. Those were the mornings when even illusion could not help, when every touch still lingered on her skin, when shame and fatigue blurred the line between memory and flesh. The mirror waited silently, unused, but on most days, she returned to it, not because it flattered her. It didn't, but because it was the only thing that saw her entirely. The men only saw fragments, a smile, a hip, a sigh. The other women saw the outcome, never the process. But the mirror saw her in transition, between the girl she was and the woman she had to be. She sometimes imagined who else had stared into it before her mother. Had it once belonged to a noblewoman, a dancer, a servant? Mirrors outlived their owners. They absorbed faces, held secrets. Maybe that's why this one felt so heavy sometimes, as if all its past reflections clung inside it. Weeping when she looked into it now, she saw a map, lines at the corner of her mouth, not from laughter but from biting back words. Faint pocks on her cheeks from old blemishes untreated. Her eyes, once wide with wonder, now narrowed with calculation. Nothing escaped the mirror's eye. It stripped her of fantasy and left only fact. Still, she painted lip stain from pomegranate rind, a dab of resin to smooth her brow, a final sweep of dusted talc to mask the shine of fatigue. Each movement precise. She knew how to draw desire from tired skin. She'd mastered the illusion. Even if she no longer believed in it, others did, and that belief fed her. Once, a client told her she looked like a goddess. She had smiled and thanked him. Later that night, she stared into the mirror and whispered, "Which one?" Not Iseshi had no power to heal. Not Hathajoy had abandoned her. Not Sekhmet though. Sometimes, rage did visit. Perhaps she was her own deity now, patron of endurance, saint of the painted face. She didn't clean the mirror often. Dust would gather at its corners. Sometimes the streaks of oil and powder created shadows on her reflection, but she left them. She liked the blurring, the imperfections. It softened the truth, made it gentler to witness. After all, honesty could be cruel. The mirror had taught her that. There were times she wished she could stop looking, to walk through life unreflected, unseen. But in her world, reflection was currency. She had to know what they saw, had to control it. Even if she despised the image, she needed to manage its power. Like a merchant inspecting goods before market, she assessed her face for flaws, then wrapped it in perfume and silence. She had learned to hold her breath as she painted, a habit, a small moment of stillness, a kind of dying, just for a second, as she transformed. Each stroke of color was a farewell to truth, and when she finally stood, face set, shoulders squared, she no longer belonged to herself. She was the creation of the mirror's morning. At night, she often hesitated before putting it away. Her hand would linger on its edge, fingers tracing the dented rim. She sometimes considered smashing it, ending the ritual, ending the lies, but she never did it. Without the mirror, who would she become? What would remain when there was no longer an image to prepare? On the nights when dreams found her, they were filled with reflections not of her face, but of other girls, other eyes, other painted lips, a procession of women lost to history, remembered only by broken mirrors buried in sand. And she would wake up weeping, uncertain if she had mourned for them or for herself. She did not love the mirror. She did not hate it. It was simply the companion she had inherited, a silent witness, a cruel friend. It watched her change and watched her fall. It never lied, but never comforted. And in that, it became sacred, not like a temple statue, but like a grave. Every morning she would lift it again, hold it steady, meet the gaze that was hers and not hers. And once the transformation was complete, she would tuck it back into its corner, away from eyes that did not understand. It did not belong to them. The morning in the mirror was hers alone. In the gilded silence of temple courtyards, where incense curled like a serpent through columns, they walked barefoot, deliberate, anointed not in shame, but in purpose. The women who served Hathor were not like the others who sold their bodies in alleyways and beer dens. These were chosen, or so they were told, selected by signs, dreams, and the whispers of elder priestesses. Their hands were not calloused by grinding grain or washing linen, but perfumed, adorned with henna, and softened by ritual. They were called Hesed, and their role was far more complex than a modern tongue might call prostitute. Their temple was a house of sacred music, fertility, wine, and sensuality. Hathor, goddess of love, dance, motherhood, and music, required joy and flesh as offerings. And so, the Hesed offered themselves not as victims, but as vessels. They bore songs on their tongues and sacred oil on their thighs. Their laughter was as rehearsed as their moans. Their presence was artful, calculated devotion. Each morning began with bathing in cool, perfumed water drawn from temple cisterns. It was not just to cleanse the body, but to wash away the day before. Water was memory, and the priestesses bathed, not as women, but as divine conduits. Their attendants scrubbed their limbs with powdered lotus root, combed oils through their hair, and painted their eyes with black coal to honor the sacred gaze of the goddess herself. In silence, they would then gather in a circular chamber lit by small flames. The high priestess would offer prayers not to ask for protection, but to call down beauty, seduction, and fertility into their bodies. Each woman stood still while incense passed beneath their chins, a ritual meant to coax the divine into their lungs. Only then were they permitted to dress in linen so sheer it caught the breath of air, sewn to shimmer like moonlight on Nile water. Their lives were not without order. Every gesture, every glance, every movement was guided by scripture and training. When to speak, when to touch, when to sing. A wrong word, a misplaced hand, could offend the goddess. Their pleasure was not their own. It was a sacrament. Their pain, if it came, was buried beneath perfume and poetry. They learned to turn it into rhythm, into gesture, into the slow tilt of a wrist. Music surrounded them constantly. Sistrums in the morning, harps by dusk. Songs passed down from generation to generation, each note tuned to awaken emotion. Some believed the vibrations of the sistrum kept chaos at bay. Others believed it aroused the gods. The Hesed played them both ways, humming as they walked through courtyards, letting their hips sway with ancient memory. Not all visitors were permitted to touch them. Most came only to watch the way one gazes at a statue too sacred to kiss. Nobles, priests, generals, they came not only for the carnal, but for comfort, for prophecy, for a taste of the divine filtered through flesh. The Hesed could speak in riddles, delivered dreams, offered tears to heal a man's grief. They were courtesans, yes, but also mystics and mirrors. There was a chamber deep within the temple called the Room of Eyes. Its walls were covered with painted gazes, sorrowful, knowing this was where the Hesed performed their most private rites. Beneath the soft golden light of oil lamps, they sang to men who had forgotten how to feel. They anointed the wounded. They wept with the grieving. They bled with the lonely. And always, they did so with the grace of the goddess in their breath. Some of them believed they were reborn each time they entered that chamber, that when they walked in barefoot, wrapped in translucent linen, they were no longer themselves but Hathor incarnate. And when they emerged, hours later, they shed that divinity like a skin. They returned to their sisters exhausted, yet shimmering, with a strange kind of peace. They were not allowed to marry. Not officially. Their bodies were claimed by the temple, their futures written in ritual. Some fell in love anyway with scribes, guards, or even each other. These affairs were quiet, hidden in glances and whispered notes left in oil jars. The penalty for discovery was exile. But still, love crept in like ivy. Not even gods could stop that. Not all saw them as sacred. Many outside the temple whispered other words: harlot, siren, deceiver. Wives feared them, husbands dreamt of them, children were told to look away. And yet, these same doubters sent offerings to Hathor, seeking fertility, love, and joy, the very blessings the Hesed embodied. The contradiction was never spoken aloud, but it sat in every glance. Every awkward silence at the edge of festival processions. Festivals were their moment of glory. During the feast of drunkenness, they emerged into the city streets, dancing, laughing, pouring wine and flinging flower petals like stars. The city roared in their presence. Their hair was braided with gold. Their voices echoed against temple walls. They became celestial for a night, beloved and untouchable. But once the last lamp was extinguished, they returned quietly to the stone halls, taking their laughter off like a veil. Some of the older Hesed bore scars, not visible but sensed in how they moved slower, how they sang softer, how they touched with gentler hands. They had lived through decades of desire, of carrying strangers' grief. These women became teachers. They whispered wisdom into the ears of the younger ones while braiding their hair, rubbing oils into their backs. Do not let your heart go where your body must, they warned, and never forget to dance for yourself. The youngest among them often arrived confused, frightened, drawn from small villages by dreams or desperation. They cried at night. Some ran, some broke, but others adapted. They learned quickly to mask fear with rhythm, to lace sorrow into melody. The temple swallowed them, transformed them. Some became stars in the eyes of nobles, others faded into routine, but all were shaped. There were nights when the temple halls fell still, and the women sat together in silence, backs against pillars. They shared fruit, wine, and laughter that was quieter than during the day. In those hours, they became girls again, not goddesses. They spoke of memories, regrets, sometimes dreams. And when sleep came, it was heavy and full of incense. Some claimed that when a Hesed died, her body was buried with great care, wrapped not in shrouds, but in celebration. Her scent lingered in the hallways for days, a parting gift. It was said Hathor herself descended in the form of a cow-headed woman, placing a kiss on the brow of the faithful. Whether this was myth or mercy, no one questioned it. Those who left the temple never truly escaped it. Even years later, walking through distant cities, their posture betrayed them. They stood too straight, smiled too precisely. Their eyes carried stories no one could name. And always, beneath the scent of new oils or older dust, there lingered a hint of lotus, a memory of what they once were. Some returned, not as servants, but as seekers. They came to leave offerings, to kneel in the shadows and whisper to the walls. They asked for forgiveness, or gave thanks, or simply needed to be seen again, if only by the statues. The temple took nothing back, but it never forgot. In the end, their stories were not carved into monuments. No scrolls recorded their names. Yet every man who walked through their chambers, every song that trembled on their lips, every tear kissed from a stranger's cheek, those things echoed. They became part of the temple's breath, woven into its stones, humming through it forever. The market wall, worn smooth by time and heat, became her throne. She leaned upon it, not like a woman resting, but like a statue meant to be seen. The sandstone was warm against her back, and the shade it provided was slight, yet she stood there. Every day, as if ordained to behind her, the wall whispered of centuries, and before her, the world passed in pieces, smells of cumin and sweat, the clatter of pottery, the laughter of children running barefoot through the dust. She did not call out to men, not like the fruit sellers or the breadwomen did. Her silence was its own form of advertisement. She wore linen that shimmered faintly when it caught the sun, and her eyes bore a black coal line so clean it could have been carved by a knife. Her hands were folded loosely, her ankles crossed like reeds on water. The men knew her name, or they invented one to whisper as they passed. Either way, she heard them all. The market was chaos and rhythm. Men bartered for goats, women haggled over salt, but she stood still, a calm in the center of it. Even the dust seemed to avoid her feet. Sometimes she would smile not at anyone, but at something within herself, a memory perhaps, or an irony no one else would catch. The butcher's boy once said she smiled like she'd seen all the gods, and they were not as powerful as she. Some thought she was waiting for a lover, others thought she was cursed to stand there forever. But the truth was simpler and stranger. She was watching, not the people, but what they carried: lust, grief, longing, boredom. She could read them like clay tablets. A man's need pulsed off him like heat from an oven. A woman's sorrow dragged behind her like a tattered veil. And in these things, the woman at the wall found her invitations. When someone worthy approached, not because of gold, but because of weight, because of sorrow or silence or questions, they would find themselves stopping, not always knowing why. Their feet simply forgot how to move, and she, the woman by the wall, would lift one hand, gently. That was all it took. A curl of her finger, and they followed her, not out of desire, but out of recognition, as though they'd seen her in a dream long ago. She led them through the alleys behind the potter's lanes, where the smells turned from spice to clay, to something deeper, something like ancient wood, or the breath of the Nile at midnight. Her room was not far, but the walk felt eternal, like stepping between worlds. The door was simple wood, but once inside, the air shifted. It was cooler, darker, lit only by small oil lamps and the scent of burning myrrh. She asked no questions. Sometimes they wept before touching her. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. There was no performance here, no ritual, only presence. She let them unravel, not just their clothes, but their stories. A merchant confessed he feared dying unnoticed. A soldier whispered that the faces of the dead followed him into sleep. A priest laid his head in her lap and asked if she believed in anything at all. She never lied. If she had no answer, she said nothing. If she had a truth, she offered it gently, like a fruit peeled and split. She was not a healer, nor a goddess, but something humbler and more necessary: a listener. In this way, her days were not wasted. She gathered stories the way others gathered grain. Her room became a granary of grief, a harvest of human ache. Outside, the market changed little. Seasons passed in sand-colored sameness. New vendors arrived, old ones died. But she remained, always by the wall. Time touched her lightly. Some said she aged backward. Others claimed she was a different woman every year, simply wearing the same linen and scent. But they were wrong. She was constant. It was the world that forgot how to see her. Children grew up watching her. At first, they mocked. Then they grew silent. By adulthood, they averted their eyes or nodded respectfully as they passed. No one dared touch her uninvited, not even the boldest drunkards or soldiers on leave. There was something sacred in her stillness, something that warned, this is not for conquest. Once a foreigner tried to buy her time with gold coins and broken Egyptian. She did not look up. Her hand remained still, and her silence louder than a shout. The man left, confused and insulted, but never returned. Later, she was seen whispering something into a pottery shard and burying it beneath her sandal. Some believed it was a curse, others thought it was a prayer. Her name was never spoken twice the same way. In the south, they called her the Watcher. In the north, the Mirror of Men. In the marketplace, she was simply the woman by the wall. But among the old women who cleaned temples and poured libations, she was known as Servant of Silence. They claimed she had once served Hathor, but had left, not in disgrace, but in fulfillment. Not all her work was with men. Women came to Selm to ask how to endure a loveless marriage, some to ask what beauty was, some to ask if it could ever return. She treated them no differently. To her, pain was pain, no matter the vessel. She listened. She sometimes wept. Once, she painted a widow's lips red and told her, "There is still honey in you, let them taste it." The wall behind her bore marks from years of leaning oil from her skin, lines where her braid rubbed, scuffs from sandals shifting. It became a relic, a part of her. When she was absent on holy days, or during illness, the market felt different. The laughter was thinner, the bargaining more cruel. Even the pigeons seemed louder. Her silence was necessary, like a counterweight to all the noise. She wrote nothing down, but sometimes, at dusk, she would draw symbols in the dust with her. Toa, spiral, a wave, the shape of a mouth. The children watched, tried to copy them. They thought it was a game, but older ones began to understand. These were not games. These were echoes, reminders, lessons for those who knew how to see with something other than their eyes. One day, a young scribe brought her papyrus and ink. He begged to write her story. She looked at him for a long time and finally said, "You'll only write your version of me." He agreed. "Then write that," she said, and walked away, disappearing into the narrow maze of market alleys. The boy never found her again. Some say she died behind that wall, still standing, that the wall crumbled around her body and revealed no bones, only a thin trace of perfume. Others say she became a bird and flew west with the sun, and still others insist she never existed at all, that she was a hallucination born from heat and hunger and longing. But the wall still stands, empty now. And yet every afternoon, when the shadows fall just right and the market hushes for a moment, people swear they see the shape of a woman there still, waiting, wrapped in linen and memory, as if watching them all, as if listening. She never asked them for their names. It wasn't a rule, but something more instinctual, more sacred. Names, she believed, had too much weight, too much history attached to them. In her small room with faded cloths and flickering lamps, identity was shared alongside clothing. What mattered was presence, the breath between two strangers, the closeness of skin, and the truths they told in silence. In that space, unburdened by titles, love could bloom, not the love poets immortalized, but something simpler, quieter. When they arrived, they often tried to introduce themselves, their mouths forming syllables full of pride or apology, but she would touch her lips lightly, then theirs, and they would stop. It was not rejection, it was protection, for them and for her. Outside they were warriors, merchants, scribes, and thieves, but within these walls, they were only craving warmth, and she was the flame they sought. No name was needed for that kind of exchange. She knew how to look at them in a way that unraveled years, eyes that held neither judgment nor pity, but something older. Her gaze was deep enough to drown in, soft enough to land like feathers on bruised hearts. Some cried the first time they met her eyes. They didn't always understand why, but she did. It was the release, the shedding of masks that had grown into skin. In her presence, they remembered how to feel without needing to explain it. Some brought gifts, thinking they could impress her: copper bracelets, scented oils, rare dates. She accepted them with a nod, placed them carefully in corners where other offerings lay, but she never showed preference, never gave more for gold than she did for a humble smile. Her currency was connection, and the richest among them were often the poorest in that regard. Fumbling with affection like men holding a serpent by the tail, their hands searched her body, not like explorers, but but like pilgrims, as if each curve held secrets to their own redemption. She allowed them to trace her ribs, her collarbones, the faint scar on her thigh. She didn't flinch or pretend. Her body was not a temple, not a battlefield. It was earth, dark, fertile, and forgiving. And in that space, they dug not for pleasure, but for something lost, something they couldn't name but hoped she could return. She never whispered sweet nothings. Her voice was reserved for truth. If she sensed their sadness, she named it gently. If she sensed their fear, she offered touch without question. There were no declarations, no promises of forever. Only now. Only breath and skin and the slow unfolding of tension. In her silence, many heard more than they had from lovers who'd known them for years. Not all who came sought her body. Some simply wanted to lie beside her, heads resting on woven mats, their fingers grazing her arm as if checking whether she was real. She allowed it. She did not measure love by what they gave or took, but by how present they remained. Some left their shoes outside her door and wept in her lap. Others fell asleep with their hands clutching hers, like children who had forgotten what safety felt like. The days blurred. Lovers came and went, shadows crossing her threshold like tides pulled by unseen moons. She remembered their touches, not their names. A man who kissed her shoulder like it was an altar. A woman who braided her hair in silence. A boy who trembled when she touched his chest, whispering that no one had ever held him like he mattered. In her memory, there were songs without lyrics, just melodies. Sometimes she wondered what it would be like to love someone and stay, to know their name, their favorite fruit, their childhood fears. But that was not her path. She was not built for possession. She was built for passage, for guiding souls across emotional rivers they could not cross alone. She was the bridge, not the destination. And though loneliness crept in sometimes, she knew the alternative would be less honest. The women in the city whispered about her, some with admiration, some with disdain. They said she took too much, gave too freely, but they didn't know how many broken men she'd stitched together with only her presence. They didn't see how many mothers she helped return to their children lighter. They didn't know that love, when given without claim, could heal in ways deeper than a husband's vow or a lover's poem. Her body bore the memory of every embrace, a shoulder that remembered a thief's confession, a thigh that tingled when she thought of the mute man who never left her side for 3 nights. Her skin was a tapestry of emotion, invisible to all but her. She sometimes lay awake, tracing her own limbs with fingers like ink, remembering the stories each place carried. One evening, a young woman arrived. Her hands trembled. She wore no makeup, no perfume, just fear and hope. The woman did not touch her immediately. Instead, they sat. Hours passed. Finally, the girl placed her hand on the older woman's heart. "You're not what they say," she whispered. The woman smiled. "Neither are you." That night, no clothes were removed, no candles lit, but a different kind of love passed between them, one that lasted long after the girl had gone. She never kept count. She didn't need to. Each encounter was complete in itself. A circle closed before the next began. There was no ledger, no tally, only echoes, soft echoes that clung to the drapes, hid in the folds of linen, and danced in the flicker of lamp flames. She was not forgotten, because she had never asked to be remembered. Her gift was the moment, and in it, she made them feel eternal. Sometimes she passed them in the street. Men who'd wept against her back, women who'd laughed in her bed. They walked past her without a word. Some met her eyes and nodded. Others looked away, ashamed of their own vulnerability. She never broke the illusion. She was a ghost in daylight, a secret preserved. A child once asked her if she was married. She laughed softly and said, "No, but I've been loved 1,000 ways." The child did not understand, but she hoped one day he would. Not all love needed a name. Some love was like wind felt but never seen, necessary but never owned. She carried no jewelry, wore no amulets of affection, but within her chest lived 1,000 heartbeats, some slow and tender, others fast and desperate. She was a vessel, and though often empty at dawn, by dusk she brimmed with feelings never spoken aloud. And that was enough. It had to be. No temple bore her statue, no poet wrote her ballad, but in the quiet spaces of memory, between wars, between lovers, between lives, she existed, not as a woman with a name, but as a sensation, a breath, a warmth, a truth. And when people closed their eyes and remembered the one time they felt completely seen, It was her face they pictured. By the time the second sunbeam cut across her mat, she was already counting. Not stars, not memories, but offerings. Not all who came could pay in coins, and so her life had become a tapestry of objects and fragments. A worn piece of linen, its threadbare folds still smelling of a dead mother. A small loaf of barley bread, hardened at the edges. A carved bead that had once hung from a child's neck. These were her currency, her proof that she'd mattered to someone. Even for a moment. The coins came from soldiers, mostly men with dust in their beards and guilt in their eyes. Their payments were often heavy with silence. Some dropped silver pieces on the floor like they were disposing of sin. Others placed them softly on her palm, their hands lingering longer than necessary, as if hoping she'd read something in their skin. She never judged the way it was given. All metal melts the same under fire. Linen was more tender. Often it came from women, quietly folded, tied with bits of twine, a shift too thin for wear, but still warm with the body that had worn it. A veil with the scent of lotus still clinging to its edge. One time, a woman left behind a hem stained with dried milk and whispered, "My child no longer needs this, but I think you might." It was not about need, it was about sharing something that had once mattered. The bread was sacred in a different way. Those who brought it did so with humility. Farmers with mud still drying on their ankles. Bakers with flour in their creases. The bread was never large, never soft, but she always accepted it with both hands. It reminded her of her father's hut, of mornings where love was hidden in every crumb. Sometimes she ate it alone, each bite a small prayer to the god of memory. She kept these offerings in small bundles, sorted in clay jars and baskets. The coins were wrapped in palm fiber, buried in a floorboard crack that no one but her knew. The linens were folded with reverence, stacked like layered sighs. The bread she either consumed or crumbled at the base of her doorway, for the cats, the birds, or whatever spirits walked past in hunger. She believed even ghosts needed sustenance. She had long since stopped counting her worth in bronze weights. Value, she learned, lay in the hands that gave. A wealthy merchant once tried to pay her with gold earrings, freshly pulled from his second wife's ears. She returned them. "These were not yours to give," she said. He left angry, and that night she slept better than she had in weeks. What she accepted was always hers, given freely, not torn from others like plunder. Not all gifts were physical. Some offered songs, broken melodies, sung into her shoulder as they wept. Some gave her secrets, hushed into her hair, never to be spoken aloud again. Others gave her stories, names of lost sisters, places they dreamed of reaching, deaths they never mourned. She held these with as much care as she did linen and silver. They were heavier in their own way. A dying man once came with nothing but a cracked reed flute. "I have no coin," he said, "but I can play you the song my mother sang while dying." She held his hand and listened until the tune fell apart in his breath. He died a week later. She kept the flute near her lamp, and on nights when she felt forgotten, she touched it and hummed what she remembered of the song. She often wondered which of these offerings would follow her into the next world. Would she arrive in Duat with arms full of fabric, her fingers sticky with barley, or would her soul be measured by the softness of voices that had cried against her chest? She didn't know, but she hoped that the gods understood that love came in many currencies, and not all wealth glittered. The scribes would never write of her. Her inventory would not be logged beside the ledgers of merchants, but somewhere in the linen she'd tucked behind her sleeping mat, there was a strip embroidered with tiny scarabs stitched by a child whose father she'd soothed in his grief. That cloth was her monument, unseen but deeply rooted. In the market, she sometimes traded what she'd been given: a copper button for a fig, a thin bracelet for oil. The women at the stalls never asked where the items came from. They simply nodded and handed her what she needed. They understood, in the way only women living outside the record books ever could. A priest once told her that only offerings made at the temple were sacred. She smiled and said nothing. That night, she pressed a honeyed fig into the hand of a fevered girl, then wrapped her in a veil brought by a grieving widow. If the gods had ears, she believed, they listened better in the silence between transactions than in the chants of marble halls. Some items she refused to part with: a child's drawing of a lion, a broken ring with 3 names carved inside, a lock of hair tied with gold thread. These she kept not because they were valuable, but because they anchored her. In a life built on impermanence, they reminded her that she was, at least for someone, unforgettable. Her favorite offering had been neither bread nor bronze. It had been a letter, folded neatly, placed under a stone on her doorstep, written in careful, clumsy hieratic. "Thank you for giving me back my own skin." No name, no return address, but she carried it in her robe for months, unfolding it like a prayer each time she doubted her worth. She had been offered love in many forms, but rarely truth. One man brought her 3 pomegranates and told her he loved her. She kissed his palm and asked, "Do you love me, or the way I make you feel?" He didn't answer. That night, she buried one of the fruits under the fig tree behind her dwelling. The tree bore sweeter fruit the next year. There were nights when she had nothing left to give but presents. She would lie beside them in silence, offering her breath, her heartbeat, her stillness. And when they rose, they often left her a small finger feather, a carved shell, a whisper. None of these could be sold, but they filled her like nothing else could. She knew that in the end, she'd be buried with little, perhaps a single linen wrap, a coin on each eye, if someone remembered. But she hoped someone, just one, might place a crust of bread by her side. Not because she was hungry, but because it would mean someone remembered how she'd fed them when the world forgot them. She sometimes lit a lamp with oil given by a weeping farmer. "This is from my wife's funeral," he'd said. She loved lamps. As it burned, she whispered his wife's name 3 times and watched the flame flicker. In that gesture, she felt holy, not like a priestess, but like a firekeeper, the warmth of others long after they had gone cold. One winter, when food was short, she gave back what she'd been given. She bundled the linens into small squares, packed the barley loaves into palm leaf wrappings, and walked to the edge of the slums. There, she left them quietly by doorways. No one saw her. But that night, the city seemed to sleep a little easier. Every offering was used. Some she let rot, mold, vanish. A dried lotus that had lost its scent, a robe too torn to mend. She let them go without guilt. Every gift had its time. Her life was a flow, not a hoard. What remained, remained. What vanished had already served its purpose. And in her final breath, someday, she hoped to remember not who she had touched, but what they had given her in return. Not the weight of coins, but the weight of being seen, remembered, cherished. Love without debt, bread without hunger, linen without name. The scent hit before the shadows settled, the sharp bite of yeast, sweat, and sweet rot. It clung to the clay steps leading downward, into the low belly of a structure known to men as pleasure, and to women as endurance. The house of beer, by name, invited laughter and dancing. But below, in its humid lower rooms, laughter was a rare visitor. The stone walls were damp, not from water, but from breath and heat, and the long persistence of bodies passing through with more need than grace. She descended each day with sandals tied high and mine tied tighter. The upper rooms belonged to the singers, to the ones who lured customers with voice and flirtation, who never saw the real business of pain. But she belonged to the silence beneath, where time had no place, and the lamps burned with the oil of forgotten names. Her chamber had no door, only a hanging of old reed mats, stained and curling. She adjusted them every morning like she was straightening the veil of a mourning widow. The other women arrived one by one, their greetings wordless, a nod, a glance. They wrapped themselves in linen so thin it could not hide anything but dignity, and even that, it failed to hold after the first hour. Their eyes never met. It was not out of shame but survival. Eye contact was intimacy, and in this place, intimacy was too sharp a luxury. They prepared themselves like priests before sacrifice, not with prayer, but with oil on the skin, coal for the eyes, a practiced softness in the shoulders. Men came without knocking. Some were already drunk. Some were sober and smelled of ink and ledgers, weighing their pleasure in cubits and measures. They entered the room and left parts of themselves behind muddy footprints, the echoes of curses, seed, sometimes blood. She greeted each one like an actress whose role was carved into her bones. She knew what to offer, what not to say, how to become both desired and invisible. When a man asked for a story, she lied sweetly. Tales of temple dancers, of being the daughter of a spice merchant. Once, she invented a twin sister who drowned in the Nile, and the man cried afterward, as if sorrow was worth more coin. She kept these stories in her mind, polishing them like beads, reusing them when the faces blurred, and only the voices changed. Stories were her currency, too, even when they were false. Some men did not want touch. They came to be held, to whisper into her ear the names of the dead or the weight of their failures. One, a soldier, wept for the camel he had lost in Nubia. Another, a tax scribe, trembled as he confessed to forging tallies, afraid the gods would carve out his tongue. She said nothing. She only breathed, the way her mother once did when she was ill and needed warmth more than medicine. There was no clock, but she felt the hours in her body, in the tightening of her back, in the thirst behind her tongue, in the hollowness of her belly. They were not allowed to eat until the midday bell. The reason, the owner said, was to keep the body light, desirable, agile. But hunger also dulled the will. It made them easier to bend, easier to forget that they were more than this place. She used the hunger as a compass. When the ache became sharp, she knew the day was nearly done. Sometimes fights broke out, men disagreeing over whose turn it was, women defending their corner of the room. Once a girl was struck with a broken cup. The blood mixed with the spilled beer, and no one cleaned it for hours. The owner scolded them not for the injury, but for staining the floor where paying guests would see. The girl left a week later. Some said she died. Others said she married a fisherman. Either fate felt the same to those who remained. She found small ways to reclaim space. A flower petal hidden under her mat. A mark scratched into the wall with a hairpin one for each day survived. A humming tune from her childhood, sung only in her mind while she worked. These small rebellions were her offerings to Hathor, who had once smiled upon women, or so the temples said. She wondered if Hathor ever visited these rooms anymore, or if even the gods forgot how low the ceiling could feel. The lamps were trimmed by an old woman they called Teti. No one knew her age. She had been there before the reed mats, before the stone floor cracked. She lit the oil, kept the shadows at bay, and sometimes offered dried figs to the girls who looked weakest. "Eat this before you fall into the walls," she'd say. No one asked what that meant, but they ate anyway. Teti never worked, not anymore. She had graduated from pain, or maybe descended too far to care. There were whispers of a girl who escaped, not ran away but truly escaped. A priest paid her debt and took her to be a singer at the festival of Opet. They said she wore gold bangles and sat beneath a canopy. They said her voice summoned doves. But in places like this, stories like that were stitched together from longing, not truth. Still, on hard nights, she closed her eyes and imagined what doves would sound like in flight. They cleaned the rooms themselves. At twilight, after the last customer left, and the upper levels filled with drunk chanting, they brought water in basins, no soap, just cold water in rags. They scrubbed the stone and their own skin, not to feel clean, but to remember where their flesh began and the world ended. It was a ritual, a preparation for the next day's descent. The scrubbing did not erase the grime, but it reminded them that their hands were still their own. Some of the women carved their names into the underside of the table. She found one once, Menet 9th year of the Lotus Flood. It was like discovering a fossil, proof that someone else had survived long enough to leave a trace. She added hers beneath it. Sahura, year 12, month of intoxication. A tiny rebellion, carved with a bone pin. When the wood splintered under her hand, it bled like skin. The owner came down once a week, counting heads, counting coins, never faces. He smelled of cinnamon and politics. He never spoke to them unless one was sick or caused a disturbance. He did not need to. His presence was like the Nile flood, inevitable, impersonal, powerful. The girls avoided his gaze, though some smiled too widely, hoping for a favor. He never noticed or pretended not to. There were nights she couldn't sleep, even after the work was done. She lay staring at the low ceiling, tracing cracks in the stone. She imagined each crack as a river, her spirit a boat floating between them. Some nights, the rivers became veins, and she felt herself pulse with something old and angry. Not grief, not fear, just a hunger to be more than what the lower rooms had made of her. A boy once brought her a lotus flower. He was too young to understand what she was, but he had seen her washing in the stream. "For your hair," he said, and ran off. She pressed the flower between two strips of papyrus and hid it inside her mat. It turned brown in days, but its shape remained. It was the closest thing she had to a treasure. Each morning, as she walked back up those clay steps, her knees groaned, her back complained, but her mind was quiet. She had made it through another day without breaking, and in this place, that was enough. Some broke loudly, crying, screaming, vanishing. Others broke inwardly, their eyes hollowing day by day. She promised herself she would not be either. Not yet. The upper girls sometimes mocked them, called them mudbirds or stone wives, but when they passed by in the hallway, the lower women stood tall, their spines trained by repetition, not pride. They knew the upper girls would fall eventually. Beauty fades, music gets drowned, but the ones below, they learned how to live in rot and still breathe. That was its own kind of power. No one brought flowers here. No incense was lit in their honor. But sometimes, in the quiet hour before dusk, the room filled with a warmth that wasn't just from the oil lamps. A girl would hum, another would laugh softly. For a moment, it felt like sisterhood, not survival. And in that flicker, something sacred, pulsed, known to gods, unseen by scribes, but real. She learned early that kisses were not for love. They were for negotiation, disguise, diversion. Her mother once whispered, "A kiss can be a blade, if you use it properly." And so, her lips became a second set of eyes, always watching, always calculating. In the mirror, she practiced the curve of a smile that looked real enough to disarm, but false enough to keep the soul locked away. Each morning, before facing the day, she kissed her own reflection, not out of vanity, but rehearsal. The kiss on the hand for the priest who passed without looking, the kiss on the cheek for the soldier who wept when no one else would, the lingering kiss on the neck of the merchant who brought better linen if he believed he mattered. She kept a ledger not of coin, but of lips, who received what, and why. It was an economy of its own, older than wheat and more delicate than alabaster. The art was not in the kiss itself, but in knowing who needed it to mean nothing and who needed it to mean everything. There was one man, older, who asked her to kiss his scars. She didn't ask where they came from. She kissed them like a scribe, correcting mistakes in a scroll, deliberate, slow, forgiving. He returned the next week, not for her body, but for that quiet absolution. Others wanted no kiss at all, only the cold mechanics of flesh, as if warmth were too dangerous. She gave them what they wanted, and withheld what they feared. That, too, was a form of power. She came to know the types by how they kissed. The liars kissed too quickly. The cowards hesitated. The lonely kissed like drowning men grasping at driftwood. The cruel ones didn't kiss at all, or they bit, calling it play. She learned to read each man by his mouth before he ever spoke a word. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined a kiss given for no reason, a soft thing under a fig tree, away from the scent of beer and ash. But such kisses belonged to dreams. When she kissed the younger ones, boys barely grown, pretending to be men, she used a different language, a slow whispering kiss that said, "I see your fear, but I will not speak it." They often left confused, their bravado melted into silence. She hoped some would never return, that they'd find a way to seek love, somewhere cleaner, simpler. But many came back, drawn to the unspoken comfort of being seen. One girl, new and trembling, asked, "How do you not hate it?" She did not answer at first. Instead, she pressed a kiss to the girl's brow, like an older sister would. "Because I choose when it means something," she finally said. The girl didn't understand, not yet, but one day she would. In that house, kisses were tools and shields, sometimes weapons. Their meanings shifted like sand under the wind. Once, a nobleman's son came wearing a mask of carved wood, painted gold. He asked her to kiss the mask, not him. "My face is too known," he said, "but the mask can be kissed without consequence." She obliged, her lips brushing polished lies. When he left, he tipped her twice the usual amount. She wondered what he was hiding from the world, or from himself. The mask still smelled faintly of rose oil the next morning. There were moments, rare but sharp, when a kiss became unbearable, when it tasted like ash from burnt letters, or reminded her of someone she had forgotten to mourn. On those days, she would pull away, feign a cough, or spill a cup to create distance. No one noticed, or if they did, they pretended not to. In the house of beer, everything was pretend. Even pain wore silk and perfume. The old woman who watched the stairway told her, "Don't let your lips forget your name." It was an odd phrase, but she carried it with her. She would whisper her name into the palms of her hands at night, then press those hands to her lips before sleep. It was a ritual, a binding spell against the erasure that came with pretending for too long. Because the more she kissed without feeling, the more she risked disappearing inside her own face. One day, she kissed a man who reminded her of her father, not in appearance, but in how he waited for permission. It startled her. Afterward, she wept behind the reed mat, not because of sorrow, but because her lips had remembered something her heart tried to forget. Memory, she realized, could ride the back of a kiss like a ghost, and ghosts were never paid to leave. Some kissed her with reverence, as if she were a temple statue brought to life. Those were the most dangerous. Worship was a fickle thing. It burned bright but cooled fast. She allowed the worship, but never the faith. Faith required trust, and trust required truth. In her world, truth was more expensive than gold, and far more rare. Once, a scribe kissed her wrist and said, "You're like a verse in a forbidden hymn." She smiled politely, though she didn't understand. That night, she asked one of the literate girls what he meant. The girl said, "He means you're beautiful, but dangerous to believe in." That made her laugh, a brittle laugh that tasted like papyrus and wine. There were rules. Never kiss on the mouth unless you intend to be remembered. Never kiss with your eyes open unless you want to see their soul or let them see yours. Always wash your lips after the merchant with the sandal sore. Never kiss someone who gives you nothing but silence in return. These were not written rules, but all the women followed them, because they had been learned through bruises and regrets. A man once offered to pay extra for a kiss that meant something. She asked, "What should it mean?" He paused, surprised. "That you wanted me." She nodded, and then kissed him with a stillness that pretended need. But inside, she counted the coins in her head and whispered the names of gods she no longer believed in. When he left, he called her sacred. She felt nothing but tired. The children in the streets often mimicked her, though they didn't know her work. "That's the kiss lady," one of them said once, giggling. She laughed with them, then walked away quickly. It haunted her how easily innocence wore mockery. But then again, perhaps innocence was always the first casualty of kisses. She once dreamed of kissing someone and being kissed back, not for gain, not for pain, not for disguise, but as an echo of a shared truth. In the dream, the kiss had no beginning or end, just warmth. She woke up crying, then laughed at herself. Dreams were the most deceitful kiss of all. When the festivals came, kisses were currency. Everyone kissed, on cheeks, hands, lips, even feet. The boundary between ritual and intimacy blurred. She kissed a priest during the festival of Hathor, and tasted lotus wine and regret. He whispered, "We are all just pretending, aren't we?" And she nodded. For once, no one was pretending to believe in the pretense. Her lips grew tired. Sometimes they cracked. She would steal ointment from the physician's shelf upstairs, beeswax and honey. She applied it like armor, a soldier with no sword but her mouth. Each application a preparation for another day of deception made tender. No one taught her how to lie so sweetly, but life had. There were evenings when she stayed behind after the others left, sitting alone on the cushion, her hand resting where her next kiss would land. She practiced expressions in the dim mirror. "This is the look of longing," she'd murmur. "This is how hunger wears perfume." And then she'd laugh again, quietly, like someone who'd grown too familiar with the joke. Once, in a moment she still couldn't explain, she kissed a woman, not a customer, not a friend, just another worker. They had been talking about the past, and the silence afterward felt like a thread that had to be tied. The kiss was brief, soft, and entirely without deceit. It lingered longer in her memory than any of the others. It did not lead to more, but it reminded her that not all language needed translation. When she finally lay down each night, her lips still tingled, as if they remembered the weight of every lie, every performance, every gesture of mercy mistaken for desire. She touched them gently, thanked them for surviving, for not betraying her, even when her heart ached to scream. They were the truest part of her, the guardians of everything she never dared speak aloud. They weren't bound by blood, but by silence, dust, and the sharp whisper of survival. The women who gathered behind the reed screens at the edge of Thebes called one another sister, not because they shared a mother, but because they shared secrets, secrets heavier than linen and older than names. There was a knowing between them, unspoken, unpolished one, forged not in warmth but in the long shadows of the desert. And every day, when the morning sun lit the rooftops gold, their pact began anew. Each woman came with a different story, some buried deep beneath painted eyes and coal-lined stares. One had fled a noble's cruelty, another was sold for grain, a third had wandered into the city barefoot, knowing only that coins spoke louder than pity. Yet here, in this corner of the world, untouched by temples and far from market chants, they became a single tribe. Their voices carried the same tone, low, measured, thick with dust and weariness. Before the first men arrived, they prepared each other, braided each other's hair with care, dabbed perfume behind ears, straightened folds in gowns. It wasn't about beauty, it was about armor. Each touch was a small act of defiance. One woman murmured blessings in Old Egyptian, her hands trembling from too many nights spent pretending she didn't feel. Another smeared ochre across her cheeks, pretending the rouge would keep her dignity from fading. In the shared wash basin, their reflections rippled together. Some peered into it and saw ghosts, others saw ambition, but all saw the same eyes, tired, searching, unbroken. They had long stopped asking where the others came from. To ask meant to stir old bruises. Instead, they offered warmth in the form of silence. No judgment, no inquiry, just the weight of shared existence. There were fights, of course, over coin, over placement, over glances, but never over love. None dared claim love in a place where affection was currency. If jealousy ever rose, it was swiftly drowned in laughter and the shared reminder that men were fleeting, but sand was eternal, and they were the daughters of that sand. At night, when the air turned cool and the stars blinked like watchful eyes, they lay in a circle on woven mats. One would hum a tune from her village, another would tell stories, some true, some imagined. They all listened, even when the stories made no sense. It was the act of storytelling, the weaving of dreams in a place built on performance, that gave them something close to hope. Sometimes, one of them would not return. A guard would appear in the morning with a warning. A rumor would slither through the streets about a body by the river. They mourned in their own way, an extra pinch of myrrh in the basin, a flower tucked into a sandal, a single name whispered to the wind before sleep. Their mourning was quiet, but it clung like desert wind, sharp, invisible, constant. They spoke of gods in heart truths. Some claimed belonged to Hathor, protectress of love and music. Others mocked such claims, saying no goddess would stoop to such dust. But when lightning cracked or locusts came, they all prayed together. Fear, like beauty, made them one. And though they doubted the heavens, they never doubted each other. The eldest among them, called grandmother despite her youth, bore tattoos on her thighs that told a tale no one dared ask about. She taught them how to braid rope from palm fibers, how to cool their sandals in buried pots of wet sand, and how to hide pain behind a gaze steady enough to shame a priest. She never spoke of her past, but when she looked at the others, it was with eyes that had seen the Nile flood in blood. They carved tiny gods from clay and hid them beneath floorboards, small things, with crooked eyes and open mouths, not for worship, but for memory. Each figure held a wish, for protection, for escape, for peace. At night, some kissed the gods before sleeping, others cursed them for their silence, but none ever threw them away. In the dry courtyard, under the date tree that never bore fruit, they gathered to dance, not for customers, not for coin, but for each other. Feet striking rhythm against the earth, arms raised, not to beckon but to release. In those moments, they were not courtesans or sinners, they were the wind given shape, moving not for pleasure, but for freedom. One girl, barely 14, cried every night for a month. The others took turns holding her, braiding her hair, sitting beside her while she stared at nothing. No one asked why she wept. They didn't need to. Eventually, she stopped crying and started laughing too loud, too often. They let her laugh, even when it hurt their ears, because it meant she had chosen to stay. They spoke in code when outsiders listened. A red jar meant danger. A wet lotus meant kindness. Sand in the veil meant betrayal. Over time, the codes grew more poetic, less precise. But they all understood. It wasn't about accuracy. It was about having a language no one else could own. Some of them wrote letters to people who would never read them. Folded papyrus scraps tucked beneath the floor tiles. They never signed their names. To the one who didn't wait, one read. Another simply said, "I remember the smell of almonds." These letters were not meant to be found. They were confessions for the earth, and the earth kept them. Their feet bore calluses, their backs carried stories. When they walked through, the market eyes followed, but no mouths spoke. Respect and shame followed them in equal measure. Children dared each other to touch their robes. Merchants offered discounts they could not accept. And still they walked, heads high, eyes forward. The sand did not ask questions, and neither did they. On the hottest days, they lay like cats in the shade, draping wet cloth over their faces. Silence ruled those hours, broken only by flies and sighs. It was in those silences that the deepest truths emerged, not through words, but through the shared breath of survival. No songs, no prayers, just presence. They kept a hidden jar of coins beneath a broken tile, not for emergencies, but for one of them to escape if the time came. No one knew who would need it, but they all contributed, one coin at a time, a silent contract signed with blisters and bitten tongues. There was one among them who painted poorly but earnestly. She drew their faces on scraps of discarded parchment, not as they were, but as they wished to be, stronger, softer, free. Her drawings lined the inside of her straw chest. She said it was proof that they were more than what the world believed, that somewhere, in ink, they lived better lives. They sometimes spoke of leaving, together or one by one, going north, or east, or up into the hills where no one cared who they were. But every plan ended in silence, the silence of not having enough, the silence of fear, the silence of knowing that even in leaving, the world would still brand them with the same name. But when one finally did leave, disappearing into the early morning without a goodbye, they did not mourn. They set out fresh dates in her corner. They lit a small lamp. They whispered, "Sister of the sand, fly far," and then they resumed their day. Because life, like the desert, did not pause for departure. Each night, they returned to each other, back to the same room, the same reed mats, the same warmth, no matter what masks they wore during the day. Here they were, simply women, not for sale, not for scorn, just flesh, bone, and breath, sisters of nothing but sand and sorrow and strength. And when the wind howled, carrying the grit of the desert through the cracks in the walls, they huddled close, not to keep warm, but to remind the wind, "We are here, and we are not afraid." Because even when the world gave them no name, they gave each other a legacy of dust and endurance. The heavy knock never came loudly. It was never urgent. It didn't demand, didn't shout. It was always gentle, too gentle, like someone ashamed of what they needed. Just 3 quiet taps on the back, reed gate, or a slow rattle of the latch. That was how the rich arrived, not in gilded chariots or trumpeting processions. They came quietly, veiled, sometimes barefoot, always alone, as though the moon herself had sent them, cloaked in perfume and silence. Those who lived behind the curtains had learned the sound well. A hesitant knock meant a man of power. The louder ones belonged to drunks or soldiers with copper coins and swollen hands. But when it was delicate, deliberate, they knew to stand straighter, to whisper, to burn the best oils. The rich always smelled of cedar and frankincense, their hands clean even when their hearts were not, and they never said their names. He would enter without looking up, his eyes always scanning the cracks in the floor or the flickering lamp, as though even glancing at her would confirm his sin. These men feared the walls might speak of them, feared that their gods were watching, even here, especially here. But lust has its own gods, and those gods are greedy and deaf to prayer. She would meet him with practiced calm, not seductive presence. The air itself shifted when she stepped in. Her robe wouldn't cling, her eyes wouldn't beg. She wasn't a girl, she was a mirror in which he could see himself without judgment. And that was what they came for, not pleasure, but permission. They never came to be loved. Love required honesty. These visits were for something else, to forget titles, to dissolve identities, to play at power in a world where even the Pharaoh's son feared his shadow. Here, they could be men, not lords, not priests, just creatures of flesh pretending that coin erased consequence. They often brought gifts, never wrapped, never explained. A silver ring tucked in a sandal, a bolt of linen with their emblem removed, saffron folded into palm leaves. Once, a man left behind a papyrus scroll filled with poems written in the hand of someone else, likely not for her. She kept it anyway, because the ink didn't lie even if the man did. Some spoke, most didn't. Some wept. One laughed until he collapsed. Their emotions leaked out slowly, like wine from a cracked jar. She never asked why. That was not her place. Her place was to watch, to nod, to exist as a container for what they could not carry home. She wasn't their mistress, nor their healer, just the place where they fell apart in secret. She had rules, though none were written. No scars on the face, no drunkenness beyond speaking, no lies about leaving their wives. They could pretend, whatever they wanted, but only inside the walls. Outside, she was invisible, a name not spoken, a breath they held while passing. Inside, she was everything they feared they needed. Once, a high priest entered with sandals woven from dyed palm fronds. He kissed her ankle and refused to touch anything else. He just cried and whispered verses meant for gods, not women. When he left, he thanked her. She said nothing. Some days later, a donation appeared at the Temple of Hathor in her name. She never asked who had carved it. They came at dusk, but rarely stayed past midnight. Their world could not afford dawn's honesty. A rooster's cry could shatter everything. They always left in silence, walking backwards as though undoing time. And she always remained still, unmoved by their careful exits. If she cried, it was later, alone, into cloth that had once been a gift. Their coins were heavier, not in weight, but in cost. With every offering, something was taken, a memory erased, a boundary blurred. Some rich men wanted pain, others begged to be punished, to be reminded of blood and hunger. She never judged, only performed, because she knew, the deeper the gold, the darker the wound. They gave her nothing permanent, not love, not protection, just stories, and even those were borrowed. Stolen moments pressed into her flesh like hieroglyphs no scribe would read. She memorized them all, for herself. For the day, no one remembered her name, but the night still whispered their secrets. The other women did not envy her. They feared her, because she had seen too many things the poor would never understand. The trembling hand of a nobleman, the pure shadow of a general who cried like a child. She was a keeper of truths too heavy to carry, and yet she did. With straight spine and painted lips, she wore a necklace made of tiny beads, a gift from someone she never saw again. Each bead a token of a man who left more than coin. Some left stories, some left shame, and one left silence that never quite ended. She never took it off, even in sleep. It was her armor, her archive, her proof. Rumors spread of her among the elite, that she could read a man's fate by touching his wrist, that she spoke to spirits, that she had once refused a prince and lived to tell the tale. She neither confirmed nor denied. Let the myths grow. It kept them curious, it kept them coming, and curiosity was worth more than hunger. One day, a boy entered, dressed as a servant, but too clean to be one. He sat, shaking, and asked her what it meant to be owned. She answered with silence, because that was the only honest answer. He left without touching her. She lit a lamp and didn't speak until it burned out. Not all ghosts arrive with grey hair. They sometimes wrote her names in jest. Queen of Shadows, Bride of the Nile, she who speaks in sighs. She smiled at none. She already had a name, one no man knew, one her mother had whispered into her hair when she was still too young to bleed. That name remained locked inside her teeth, safe and whole. Her body remembered what her mind chose to forget. The grip of a nervous hand, the smell of panic disguised as perfume, the way a man's voice broke when he whispered his wife's name, not hers. She catalogued these things like prayers, not to believe in but to survive by. One rich man came, just to talk. He said he was tired of his wife's silence, of his daughter's eyes, of the way his house felt like a tomb. He never undressed. He just laid beside her and listened to her breath. When he died weeks later in a hunting accident, she placed a fig by the river, not for him, for his daughter. Sometimes, the knock came from someone she had once known in another life, a neighbor's son, a cousin's friend, the boy who threw stones into the canal when they were children. Those were the hardest. She would pretend not to remember. He would pretend not to recognize her, and they would share a moment, so quiet it nearly broke the earth. She aged without notice. The rich still came, even as her hair thinned, her hips thickened, her eyes grew lined. To them, she was not a girl. She was a place, an echo, a wound in silk. And as long as they needed that place, they would come knocking, always softly, always without names. And in the end, when the reed screen was pulled tight and the walls hummed with memory, she sat in silence, listening for the next quiet knock, because she knew shame moves gently, and the rich always knocked quietly. The love songs were never true. They spoke of wide eyes and forever, of lovers waiting beneath fig trees, of bracelets slipped onto wrists like promises. But no fig trees grew near the brothel walls, and bracelets came only when drunk hands dropped them by mistake. She had memorized every lyric since girlhood, each sweet verse floating like honeyed illusions in the air. But now, they tasted bitter. Love songs lied, and she had been raised on their lies. In the mornings, the other girls hummed them while brushing out their hair, as if rhythm could make the day more beautiful. But she never joined in. Her silence was a protest, quiet but sharp. When she was younger, she used to sing too used to believe that someone would mean the words, that love could exist inside the smoke of frankincense and the creak of old beds. But belief is a fragile thing, and hers had cracked like the edge of a worn mirror. The men brought their own versions of love, quick love, whispered love, love, paid for in linen or coins or dates. They kissed like they meant it, but she had learned that lips could lie just as easily as songs. Some moaned her name like it was sacred, some called her by another woman's. It didn't matter. In the end, the door always closed behind them, and she remained alone, combing the silence for meaning that never arrived. Sometimes she wondered if love ever existed outside of stories, or if it was just a trick the poets played, feeding the poor with dreams and the rich with guilt. She had seen both ends of that deceit scene, a merchant cry because she reminded him of a wife he had buried, seen a nobleman whisper that he wished he had met her first, before duty swallowed him. But wishes were cheap, cheaper than kisses. There was one man, years ago, who had almost made her forget. He was quiet, awkward, too gentle for this world. He asked nothing of her but time, and spoke of the stars like they were more faithful than people. He never touched her without permission. For 3 months, he came with flowers wrapped in palm fronds, and left with empty hands. She almost believed in the songs again. Then he vanished, just like the others, and no flower bloomed in his place. She stopped keeping track after that. Names blurred, voices faded, faces repeated. Love no longer tried to disguise itself. It wore its hunger plainly, and she accepted it, not as betrayal, but as truth. The love songs had lied, but the lies had shaped her. She knew now how to sing, her own kind of verse, one that never promised anything, one that never asked. Outside the brothel, the world still painted murals of lovers, entwined like vines, with gazes locked and fingers bound by fate. Tourists adored those murals. They pointed and sighed, but they never saw the cracks behind the plaster, never saw how those murals were cleaned by women like her, whose hands bore no rings, and whose hearts were quiet tombs. Sometimes, she'd find a scrap of papyrus tossed near the market with poems written by men who'd never known real hunger or need. They'd write of women with lips like pomegranates and laughter like temple bells. She would read them and chuckle. Her laughter was neither ripe nor sacred. It was coarse, real, and entirely her own. Love, in its purest form, had become a stranger. She watched it walk past, sometimes in young couples giggling under the shade, in mothers humming to their babies, in dogs curling beside sleeping boys. She never envied them, she simply observed. Her time with love had ended before it truly began. Some girls still kept dolls, remnants from their childhoods, hidden in red baskets. They whispered to them at night, as though trying to preserve a piece of softness inside the hardness. She never had such softness. Her dreams were not stitched in cloth, but inked in calluses and darkened halls. Still, she did not break. She adapted. When new girls arrived, flushed and frightened, they sometimes asked if love could happen here, if a man might fall for them, if one might take them away. She never answered. What could she say? That even the kind ones leave. That even tenderness can be bought. Instead, she offered them oil for their hair and taught them which perfumes masked sorrow best. The gods of love were carved in every temple wall, adorned with lotus and song. But she had her own gods, now gods of survival, of silence, of shadows. They did not demand incense, only resilience. They didn't promise lovers, only breath. Her pillow was filled with reeds, not down. Her sleep came in pieces, interrupted by knocks, moans, or memories. And in those slivers of rest, sometimes the love songs returned, echoing in the back of her skull. She never sang them aloud. She feared that if she did, she might start to believe again. A healer once visited, sent by a client, too ashamed to return. He gave her herbs, and told her she had a fever of the heart. She smiled. Her fever was old, older than her first blood, older than her first kiss. It was the warmth that kept her moving when everything else froze. In the deep hours of the night, when even the Nile slept, she wrote her own verses into the dust with her fingertip. They weren't about love, they were about longing, not for a man or embrace, but for honesty, for a life without pretending. but the wind always erased them before dawn. She didn't hate love. That would require feeling something for it. What she felt was older than hate and understanding, and knowing. Love, like the river, flowed where it willed. Sometimes it flooded, sometimes it dried. It was never promised, only found, and just as easily lost. One day, an old woman visited, not a client, not a relative, just a passerby who said, "I knew your mother." The crone placed a single date in her hand and whispered. She sang those songs too. Then she left, without asking for anything. That night, she hummed one of the old tunes, just once. It tasted like salt. There was a mirror in her room, cracked at the edge but still whole. She looked into it sometimes and tried to see the girl who once believed in verses. But all she saw was herself painted in color and quiet defiance. Not sad, not angry, just real. And maybe that was worth more than all the lies combined. The streets changed, the faces changed, even the buildings changed. But she remained constant behind curtains, a verse unspoken, a line between want and truth. And when the girls hummed the old songs, she never stopped them. Let them have their lullabies. The world would wake them soon enough. And so, when the last candle burned low and the night folded into itself, she leaned against the doorframe, watching the moon trace the rooftops. She didn't need songs anymore. She had memory. She had breath. She had survived. And that, in the end, was a love story the songs never told. She knew not how many children she might have carried, for none bore names, none swaddled in linen or kissed under temple shade. Her womb had become a place of forgetting. In the dark chambers of the house, it stirred, it bled, it hollowed out without fanfare. The priestesses spoke of divine birth, of Isis and Horus. But she knew births that ended in silence, in reeds washed crimson, in dreams crushed beneath coins and contracts. No man who laid beside her stayed long enough to wonder. Their love was brief, urgent, soaked in honeyed wine and muffled groans. She was warmth, not memory. When the morning came, they vanished, with the scent of lotus oil still clinging to their skin, and she remained, alone with a body that bore secrets it would never speak aloud. The other women whispered of herbs dark leaves brewed in bitter water, chewed under moonlight to silence the stirrings of life. They shared these secrets like songs passed down through generations. A handful of petals, a fragment of bark, and the womb would weep quietly. No priest, no burial, just a pain in the night, and the certainty that what could have been would now never be. Some girls clung to the hope that one day, one would stay, that a man would press his lips to their belly and say, "This is ours." They spoke of escaping, the brothel, of marriage, of motherhood, away from the heavy curtains and painted eyes. But she never entertained those dreams. She had learned early that hope was a luxury best left to those not bought by the hour. There were times, still, when her body ached in strange ways, when her breasts grew tender or her stomach tightened. She never asked the midwives, what was the point? If life stirred within, it would pass. If not, she would bleed and move on. She had no amulets to protect her, no charms from Thoth or Hathor, only silence and the faint rhythm of her breath. She had once carved a name on a shard of pottery, a name that never belonged to anyone. It was soft and beautiful, chosen from a song her mother used to sing. She buried it behind the walls, near the fig tree that never bore fruit. In her mind, she thought, if ever I bore one, this would be theirs. That was the only grave her child would ever know. Some days, she saw women at the market, with children in their arms, eyes wide, hands sticky with dates, laughter like tiny chimes. She did not envy them. She simply watched, wondering if they had chosen their lives, or if life had chosen them. A child was both gift and burden, and she had enough burdens already. The priests never spoke of wombs unless they were holy. The scribes painted queens birthing gods, noble women anointed with divine blood. But there were no scrolls about women like her whose wombs bore shadows, whose prayers were silent, whose losses were unmarked and unspoken. She was part of a lineage hidden in plain sight. She had heard the story of a prostitute who bore a child and hid it in a basket, setting it adrift on the Nile like a prayer. No one knew what became of the baby. Some said the river gods claimed it. Others said a wealthy woman found it and raised it as her own. She wondered, sometimes, if she would ever be desperate enough to do the same. When she bled, she counted the days, not out of fear, but habit. Her cycle was her only calendar. It told her she was still alive. still capable, still part of the endless loop of womanhood that stretched from slave to queen. Some cycles came late. Those were the hardest. The waiting, the uncertainty, the silent bargaining in her mind. In one particular winter she stopped bleeding for 2 moons. Her body swelled. Her appetite shifted. The others noticed but said nothing. She lay in her bed at night, hands on her stomach, feeling for movement. Nothing came. Then, one day, the pain arrived. She screamed into the mattress, and when it was done, there was only blood. No form, no cry, just emptiness. She buried that pain the same way she buried all others, behind painted lips and laughter that never reached her eyes. She danced that night, swaying beneath lantern light, her body still aching. A merchant kissed her neck and called her divine. She smiled and let him believe it, let him think her untouched by grief. The madame never asked about such things. Loss was bad for business. She once slapped a girl who cried too loud after a miscarriage. "We are not wives," she had hissed. "We are not mothers. We are vessels, nothing more." That girl ran away weeks later, barefoot and bleeding. No one saw her again. She learned to harden herself, to treat her body as separate from her soul. It bled, it bruised, it healed, but her heart remained untouched her, so she liked to believe. She couldn't afford sentiment, not when every touch was a transaction, every whisper a rehearsal. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when she let herself imagine another life. A child with her eyes, her laugh, a home with bread baking in the morning, hands tugging at her dress. But those thoughts passed quickly, like clouds over the desert, beautiful, unreachable, gone. Some girls marked their wrists with ink whenever they lost one. A tally, a remembrance she never did. She remembered in different ways, in the way she avoided certain songs, in the way she flinched at baby cries, in the way her fingers lingered on her belly after the lights went out. A traveling healer once offered her a spell to bind her womb. No more suffering, he said. No more chance of pain. She thought of it for many nights, but in the end, she refused. Even in a life of bought pleasure and quiet ruin, she wanted to keep the possibility, however small, however cruel. Her body aged, slowly, subtly. Her hips widened, her skin changed, but the ache in her womb remained a hollow echo of what could have been. It no longer hurt as sharply, but it never truly faded. She told one girl, younger than most, "Don't expect your body to love you back." The girl didn't understand then, but one day she would. One day, all women did. And when she sat by the window near dawn, watching the Nile shimmer under the first light, she whispered the name she had written long ago, just once, just to hear it aloud. It tasted like both loss and peace. A name for a womb that bore only memory, a name that would never be known. The sun at noon did not show mercy. It poured down like molten gold, blistering the stones and swelling the breath in every chest. But even under this burning weight, the house did not sleep. The air inside the curtained chambers thickened with sweat and rosewater, the smell of heat curling into the linens, into the hair, into the very skin of the women within. Midday rest was a luxury for priestesses and noblemen, not for women like her. She had once hoped that the pause between morning and evening would offer silence, a cushion to collapse upon, a bowl of figs, a sip of cool water. But clients did not move with the sun. They moved with desire, and some desires struck suddenly, selfishly, under the blaze of Ra himself. The door would creak, and a shadow would fall long across the floor, even while others slept. The other girls would groan when footsteps echoed too early. "Let him wait," they'd whisper, hiding behind beaded veils and sheer cloth. But waiting was rarely an option. They all knew the cost of turning away a man with gold. They all knew that one missed hour meant one less bit of bread, one less amulet, one more lecture from the madame whose eyes missed nothing. She tried once to take her rest at midday. She slipped away behind a screen of papyrus fans, hoping that quiet would last, but her absence was noticed. The madame's ringed hand grabbed her wrist like a snake. "No one sleeps under Ra's eye," she hissed, "not unless you've earned it." And she had not, so she returned to the chamber, eyelids heavy, body aching, and greeted another man with her tired smile. There were days when the heat made her dizzy, when her limbs trembled and her stomach twisted with nausea. But clients did not see that. They saw only painted eyes, supple skin, and promises sewn into whispers. They did not wonder how many hours she had been awake, or how little she had eaten. They came to forget, and she helped them forget, even as she tried not to forget herself. She once lay on her side, after a particularly cruel visit, face buried in the corner of the mat, her fingers clutched at a fig leaf left behind from someone's breakfast, as though it might grant her comfort. Outside, the world buzzed: vendors, goats, laughter, cries, but none of it reached her in that moment. She did not sleep. She simply disappeared into the stillness inside her mind. One girl, new and foolish with hope, asked the madame for a midday nap. "Only 1 hour," she pleaded. The madame laughed so hard she choked on her wine. "This is not a temple," she said. "You don't pray here, you perform." The girl did not ask again. In her dreams, when they came, rest looked like a courtyard shaded with vines. There was no noise, no footsteps, no urgency, just water trickling from a basin and the sound of doves fluttering. But dreams were rare. Now, when she did manage to close her eyes, her sleep was shallow and haunted by men's breath on her neck, their fingers like claws. Midday brought hunger, not just for her clients, but for her stomach often growled louder than the drum beats outside. But food was rationed, and preference was given to those who pleased the wealthiest guests. She learned to chew slowly, to stretch dates across hours, to drink her own saliva when nothing else was near. There was a corner of the house where a patch of shadow lived, just beneath a broken window shutter. If the madam was busy, she would sometimes slip there, press her back to the cool wall, and breathe as deeply as she could. It wasn't sleep, but it was something. Even 5 minutes of stillness felt sacred, like a stolen jewel hidden beneath her tongue. One man liked to come only at noon. He claimed the sun made the women more ripe, as if they were melons in a stall. She hated him most. His arrival meant sweat on her thighs before she could even sit down. He liked to linger, too, as if watching her melt beneath his weight gave him power. When he finally left, she would rinse herself 3 times and still feel him. There was no bell that marked rest, only the changing angles of sunlight through the latticework above. She learned to track the time by the shadow of a column in the hallway. When it reached the cracked tile with the fish engraving, she knew it was nearly evening. But midday stretched like a punishment. Once, a storm came unexpectedly, dark clouds thick with promise. For that hour, the world cooled. The wind passed through the house like a ghost, lifting curtains and kissing cheeks. They all sat together, the women, in silence. No one spoke, no one moved. They just sat. It was the closest they had come to rest in months. But when the clouds passed, so did the peace. A younger girl once asked her why they never got breaks, like servants or scribes. She smiled bitterly. "Because no one wants to believe we work at all," she said. "They think we just lie there, like statues, like gods in waiting." But they were not gods. They were flesh and bone, and breaking slowly. She used to count breaths during the worst hours. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. A rhythm to hold on to, when her body no longer felt like her own. Sometimes, she would imagine she was by the Nile, floating gently with the reeds. The illusion would last until someone called her name. Rest became a memory, something she once knew, like a lullaby or a mother's hum. Now, rest was a promise made in the distant future, perhaps in old age, perhaps in death, perhaps never. The madame used to say, "Sleep is for the rich and the buried." Neither group belonged to her. There was an old mat tucked in the attic above the chamber hall. Frayed and dirty, it held the shape of someone long gone. On a day when her legs failed her, she crawled up there and collapsed. The smell was awful, but the quiet, it was divine. She lasted 10 minutes before the madame found her and beat her with a sandal. She kept moving, always, because stillness invited scorn. Stillness drew attention, and in this world, attention could mean ruin. So she painted her lips, powdered her face, and greeted each hour like a soldier, marching toward a night that might never come. If the gods had pity, they never showed it. No statue of Hathor ever blinked in her direction. No offering brought ease to her limbs. She served, she smiled, she endured. That was all. The men never saw her fatigue. They saw a body, a smile, a moan, but not the dark beneath her eyes, not the bruises on her knees, not the sag in her shoulders. She hid those things well, too well. One day, a noblewoman visited the house, cloaked and silent. She studied the girls like animals, then left without choosing one. Later, they heard she'd returned home and slept for 2 full days. The irony clung to her like smoke. Some women paid for rest, Others paid by never having it. At midday, when the sun was at its cruelest, she sometimes stared at her own hands and wondered whose they were. They no longer looked like hers. Not delicate, not soft, but tools, instruments, things to be used. And when the world finally turned orange with dusk, and the house sighed with the weight of another day gone, she would stand by the doorway, eyes half closed, and think, tomorrow, perhaps I'll sleep. But she knew better. She always did. She never saw it arrive. It did not knock on the wooden doors or climb the winding stairs like the others. It did not carry a pouch of silver or whisper a name soaked in lust. Disease came quieter than any man, slower than the ink used to trace her eyes, but once it entered, it never left. It curled beneath the bedding and the breath, and every woman in the house knew its scent before they ever learned its name. They called it the burning, though it had many names. Some said it was a curse from a spurned priestess, others that it was punishment from Hathor for false love sold cheaply. But no matter the tale, they all agreed on one truth. It began inside the body, and it rotted outward like a secret gone sour. First, a discomfort, then a soreness, then pain so sharp it made walking a torment. The girls whispered about it behind folded linens, warning the new ones in hushed tones not to let the men enter without washing. If he smells like vinegar, one warned, do not let him near. But the smell was not always present, and the men were not always truthful. Some carried it and did not know. Others did and did not care. She remembered the first time she bled outside the moon's rhythm. The color was wrong, too dark, too thick. Her stomach had been twisting for days, but she'd told no one. Illness was weakness, and weakness could mean being cast out. A girl who could not serve brought in no coin. And so she worked through it, smiling, moaning, performing with the ache blooming behind her navel like a secret fire. One girl, Nefru, had screamed in the middle of the night, waking them all. She clutched her belly and wailed that her bones were breaking from within. By morning, her sheets were soaked in red and yellow, and the madame told 2 boys to carry her out before the guests arrived. No one asked where they took her. No one dared, but her room stayed empty for weeks, the smell of sickness lingering long after. They tried their own cures, poultices of crushed garlic and warm wine, oils scented with myrrh and blue lotus, whispered prayers and tied amulets under their robes. Sometimes the pain eased for a day or two, and they believed, but the burning always returned. Always. The scribes and healers in the noble districts had remedies, but they were not meant for women like her. A nobleman's concubine might be taken to a temple clinic, a common harlot, left to sweat and shake in her own room, with only the whispers of other women for comfort. The madame never paid for medicine. If the gods want you dead, who am I to interfere? She said once with a cruel laugh. She had seen a man's face bloom with sores, crusted, red, wet with pus. He'd worn a fine robe, and he spoke with silk in his voice, but his touch had been rough, and his breath stank of death. Afterward, she scrubbed herself with lye until her skin peeled. It did nothing. Days later, she too woke with fever, her joints swollen like ripe fruit. Her throat blistered from within. The others kept away. Not cruelly, not loudly, but with that fearful politeness only desperation breeds. One left her a cup of cooled barley, water by her door. Another tucked a fresh cloth beneath the mat. No one stayed longer than a moment. No one wanted to catch what clung to her skin. Some said the disease came from Nubian traders. Others said it was brought back by soldiers from the east. Still others insisted it had always been in the river, waiting to rise with the floodwaters and find the women first. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that it chose them, the ones already most used. There was no time to heal properly. A fever could only last so long before the madame demanded the bed be filled again. If you can moan in pain, you can moan for coin. She snapped once, and so she did. She welcomed men while her body burned, smiled while her womb wept. Each act was a theft from her soul. They learned to recognize the early signs in others, a client whose hands trembled, another who winced when touched. They would whisper warnings before letting the next girl in, but sometimes the girls ignored them. Hunger is louder than fear. Bread dulls the edge of suspicion, and gold blinds better than cold. One night, she saw a girl collapse mid-act. The man shrieked and backed away, and the madame rushed in to shout at the girl before even checking if she breathed. They dragged her away, dumped her outside the back gate, and barred the door. She was never mentioned again. The next night, another girl slept in that same bed, with the same linens, the same perfume, the same lies. Disease did not just touch the body, it reached the mind. The fear of it twisted smiles into grimaces. It made them cruel with each other, suspicious, resentful. One girl stole another's protective charm. Another whispered to a client that her rival was unclean. Trust eroded like stone in sand. Only silence endured. Some clients carried herbs said to ward off the sickness, and the madame encouraged the women to praise them for it. Stroke their pride, not their filth, she said. A man who thinks he's safe is easier to please. So they did. They praised and they lied and they prayed, all in the same breath. She began to dream of red rivers and swollen bodies. In the dreams, her skin peeled like bark, and her teeth fell like sand from her mouth. She would wake drenched in sweat, fingers clenched, unsure if the pain in her ribs was real or remembered. Sleep offered no peace, only deeper dread. Even the gods seemed indifferent. The shrine in the corner of the chamber, once lit with oils and flower petals, gathered dust. Hathor's eyes looked away. Bastet turned her head. No offering brought relief. No prayer brought silence to the shaking within. There were whispers of a hidden healer, an old woman near the edge of the city, who brewed potions that soothed the burning. But her price was high, and her success uneven. One girl returned with scars down her thighs from a treatment gone wrong. Still, many risked it. Pain is a powerful motivator. Hope, a cruel one. The disease left some hollow, but alive. Others it took completely. Some disappeared in the night, their names never spoken again. The madame replaced them quickly, her voice cheerful, her hands counting coin. The house did not mourn long. There was always another man waiting. She began marking the wall with tiny scratches, one for each day she survived the sickness. The wall grew crowded. It was the only record of her endurance, hidden behind a hanging of dyed linen. If she died, she wanted someone to see it, to know she had lasted longer than most. There was a day when her fever broke. She lay still, eyes wide, expecting the pain to return. But it didn't. Not right away. For a week, she moved slowly, cautiously, like a newborn colt. The other girls watched her with a mix of envy and fear. Survival was suspicious. It made people nervous, but she knew it would return. It always did. The unseen client never left for good. It just waited, quiet, cruel, and patient. More faithful than any lover, more demanding than any man. It would be back. She could feel it in her bones, in her breath, in the way her blood sometimes ran too hot. She no longer cried when the pain came. She no longer begged for relief. She only lay there, counting scratches on the wall, whispering each number like a prayer to no God at all. Night, to those outside the stone courtyards and reed-walled chambers, may have seemed like the hour of rest, the time when noise faded, and only the Nile whispered to the sky. But for her, night was the thickest part of the day, a heavy curtain of breath and heat and need that never truly lifted. The world beyond might have slept, but within the house of perfumed sheets, sleep was a forgotten art. It began before darkness had even settled, with the slow procession of lamps being lit. Thin flamed bowls of oil placed in corners, hung on hooks, scattered like stars inside walls that knew too many cries. The light was not for comfort, but for clarity, for seeing, for being seen, for selling what could not be weighed by grain or measured by cubits. Each girl knew her place before the first client arrived. The madame, in her lacquered smile, had already arranged them like painted potsum, to be near the door for the impatient. Others, cloistered near the balcony for the shy or the wealthy or the cruel. She had placed her in the room with the curtain of green beads, where the shadows fell just right on her cheeks. When the first man entered, the house changed shape. Even the walls seemed to inhale, bracing themselves. The laughter came next, forced and lilting and perfectly timed, stitched between coughs of incense and the sharp scent of wine. And beneath it, the steps, always the steps. You learned to know the kind of man from the weight of his tread. Some walked in with silence, like predators. Some clattered in with swagger, spilling stories and smoke from their robes. Others were dragged in by loneliness, their shoulders slumped, coins clutched like apologies. Each of them carved the night with their own noise, none of them quiet. Not truly. The women's voices rose and fell, like chants, each sigh rehearsed, each gasp part of the price. Sometimes it sounded like singing, if you didn't listen too close, but she had listened too long, and she could hear the tremble underneath the fatigue. the disgust, the endurance. There were moments between the clients, fleeting as mist, when she could lie back and pretend the world had stopped spinning. But always, there came the knock, or the rustle, or the breath of a stranger leaning too close. Silence was the rarest thing, even rarer than kindness. She had once tried to hum to herself, when alone, to find a song that belonged only to her, but even then, the sounds of others broke through. A slap, a sob, a laugh, twisted like rope. Even the walls were thin with pain. Noise seeped through the plaster like rot. Some men came just to talk, their mouths filled with confessions and secrets and half-truths, too shameful to share with priests. They wept into her lap, asked for forgiveness, told stories of wars they never fought and wives they never pleased. She listened. She always listened. That, too, was part of the night. The other girls often faked laughter to drown out the rest. It was a kind of armor, brittle and bright. But she didn't bother anymore. She let the night speak, let it spill and splinter and swallow. She was not afraid of its noise anymore. She was part of it. Sometimes the silence came in the form of a client who said nothing. Eyes like stone, mouth a tight line. Those were the most dangerous. Their hands spoke louder than words ever could. She learned to read fingers like verses. Tight meant control. Trembling meant guilt. Cold meant death in disguise. Once, a girl named Mirette had screamed so loudly, the walls echoed it until morning. The madame said it was a dream, that nothing happened, but everyone knew. They could still hear it days later, ringing in the corners like a curse. That scream had a shape, and it never left the room. There was always music playing somewhere. A flute, a drum, the strum of a harp plucked by fingers that had forgotten gentleness. But the music didn't soothe. It filled the gaps, painted over the bruises with melody. Even the gods would have looked away. She remembered a night when a priest came dressed in common robes, his hair dusted with sand to look poor. He said nothing until the end, when he whispered that no sin was too great for atonement. Then he paid her with an amulet shaped like an eye, and she did not know if it was a blessing or a warning. The nights were hotter than the days. The air did not move. Sweat clung to every surface, to every thought, and in the stillness of limbs, tangled and untangling, she could sometimes hear her own heartbeat, fast as a bird's wing. But even that was not silence, just another kind of sound. At dawn, the house would quiet, not out of peace, but from exhaustion. The girls would lie on their mats, or lean against stone columns, heads heavy with hours stolen by others. No words passed between them, only glances, only breath. That was as close as they came to silence. She knew a girl who had gone deaf from a fever. The madame nearly cast her out, until she realized that some men liked the idea of being unheard. That girl never flinched, never gasped, never cried. She lived in a world of silence, and they all envied her for it. Some tried to end the noise with herbs, smoked or swallowed, but the dreams were louder than the waking world. Nightmares screamed in colors too bright, hands too many, mouths too wide. In dreams, the house never slept, neither did she. Even the Nile made noise at night. The frogs, the birds, the lapping of water against the banks. It was as if the world itself refused silence, as if quiet would make the truth too clear. Better to be drowned in sound than face the echo of what they had become. She sometimes wondered if the stars were watching, if they heard, but they never blinked, they never cried out. Maybe they, too, had learned that silence was a lie. Maybe they burned in protest, unable to scream, just like her. She once tried to hold her breath for as long as she could, just to see if silence existed in her own body. But even then, her heart thudded, her blood roared. Noise was her birthright now. She could no longer imagine a world without it. By the end of the night, when the last man left and the lamps guttered out, she would sit in the corner and wrap her arms around her knees. She would listen to the walls sigh and the floorboards crick. Even in its stillness, the house spoke, and she listened, because she knew night was not silence. It was a language, and she was fluent in it. The laws of the land, carved into stone and whispered in courts, were etched to protect the balance of mat, truth, order, harmony. But for the women who lived behind curtained doorways and perfumed veils, these laws did not stretch far enough to reach them. The ink of justice dried long before it could drip into their chambers. They lived outside its shade, neither outlawed nor protected, seen only when convenient, forgotten when bruised. In daylight, Scribes walked past them with their scrolls and sealed tablets, never pausing to ask their names. The courts debated disputes between farmers, merchants, and scribes, but never the grief of a woman paid in bread for what should never have been priced. Her voice was not part of the courtroom's design. Even if she screamed before the gods, the judge would hear only silence. When a client struck too hard, tore too deep, or did not pay, the girl could run to the street, but she'd find no one, waiting with ears, only eyes that judged. The local guards, boys with copper badges and hollow pride, scoffed when she approached. You invited him in, they'd say. You laid down first. Her work erased her right to protest, as though trade cancelled pain. There were no contracts to bind these women to safety. Their consent was not notarized, their limits never drawn in ink. She had once asked an older girl what the law said about men who forced, who hurt. The girl laughed bitterly, pointing to the temple. The law belongs to those who kneel in gold, not those who lie in linen. In temples, scrolls listed divine offenses, crimes against Mat, sins punishable by exile or worse. But nowhere on those long papyri did it mention the man who left bruises shaped like fingerprints. The scribes wrote in black and red for danger, red for punishment, but never used it for women like her. They saved that ink for thieves and traitors, not for those who broke hearts instead of rules. Even priests, those solemn faces behind incense smoke, would sometimes visit the house under night's cloak, lips stained with wine, hands too practiced, and the next morning they'd preach purity from high altars, their own trespasses buried beneath layers of holy silence. If she spoke of it, they would say she lied, that her word weighed less than their titles. Some of the women bore children, sons who asked who their fathers were, but there were no scrolls to name them, no inheritance carved in clay. The law recognized heirs, not accidents. And a prostitute's son, even if his father was a noble, would be nothing more than a shadow in court. The law had eyes, but it turned them away from her lineage. A girl named Tanny once tried to bring her case before the village elders. She had been beaten until she bled by a soldier on leave, a man wrapped in royal permission. She stood with her lips split and her dignity clutched tight, but they waved her off. Soldiers served the pharaoh, one of them said, not meeting her gaze. Their time is sacred, yours is sold. The laws were obsessed with theft. Steal a loaf of bread, lose a hand. Steal a goat, face the lash. But steal a woman's agency, her breath, her safety. The law shrugged. She wondered, often, if the gods had simply forgotten to add their kind to the tablets, or if the omission was intentional. Perhaps mercy had a price they couldn't afford. Some girls carried amulets, eyes of Horus or knots of Isis, believing they'd ward off injustice. But no charm stopped a man who knew she had nowhere to run. The gods may have watched, but they did not intervene. Their statues stood silent, lips sealed in carved smiles. When disease crept into her bones, when her body broke down from nights too many and clients too rough, she couldn't walk into a healer's house like a merchant's wife could. She was turned away with politeness, sharpened like flint. We treat the respectable, they would say. She would nod, and die slowly, lawless and unseen. Even in death, they were rarely buried with honors. Their tombs, if they had any, were shallow things, tucked outside city limits. No procession, no priest to chant her name, no scribe to list her deeds in the book of the dead. Her afterlife was uncertain. Her place in the duat, the law ensured she vanished quietly. And yet, despite all this, they learned to navigate the silence like seasoned sailors. They built networks among themselves. If the law would not recognize their bonds, they created their own code, wordless glances, hidden gestures, shared secrets, justice among the unseen. Occasionally, a wealthy client would fall in love, or claim to we'd offer her escape, a new life in his estate. But the law made that impossible too. A wife needed pedigree, a record of purity, not a past soaked in wine and bruised thighs. He'd kiss her goodbye with shame, and return to a life where she could never follow. Sometimes the madame would bribe local officials for protection, but it was an illusion. A few extra coins to keep raids at bay, to look the other way when blood marked the walls. It wasn't justice, it was rent for survival. In rare cases, a woman did rise beyond her station. Perhaps she caught the eye of someone powerful, someone bold, but even then, whispers followed. The law could not erase the scent of where she'd come from. Her past was a garment no marriage could strip away. There was a legend of a prostitute who disguised herself as a priestess, sat in a temple for years until death claimed her, unnoticed and revered. Some said it proved that worth had nothing to do with origin. Others said it proved the law only loved masks. Each night, before she lay down, she touched the doorframe and whispered a name her own. It was the only law she trusted, the law of remembering. If the courts and scrolls would not see her, then she would see herself. That was her rebellion. The laws were stone. She was breath, but breath wore down stone. In time, she told stories to younger girls, tales of a world where women like them had voices and names and laws that saw them. Not because it was true, but because it could be. She held tight to the smallest justiciars, the client who paid without cruelty, the neighbor who shared bread, the girl who survived another day. They were not laws, but they were sacred, more sacred than anything written by a man with ink and power. Each time she bled and was ignored, each time she cried and was dismissed, she reminded herself, the law may not see me, but I exist, I breathe, I endure, and someday that might be enough. She sat on the edge of the low clay bed, knees folded to her chest, the candlelight flickering against the cracked walls of the room. The air was heavy with incense and the lingering scent of sweat and rose oil. In her hands, she held a tiny, carved figure Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth and protection. Her surface was worn smooth by thumb and time. She did not know if she believed in anything anymore. But tonight, she whispered to her Taweret, guardian of mothers and unborn souls, had long been a symbol of comfort among the women. They passed her image between them like secret hope tucked into linen pouches, kissed beneath breath, buried beneath pillows where no client ever looked. Not every woman in the house was a mother, but every woman feared becoming one, and every woman knew what it meant if she did. The girl closed her eyes and pressed the figure to her chest, just over the place that throbbed. Something inside her had changed slowly then, all at once. Her body was no longer just hers. Perhaps it never had been, but now it held more than bruises. It held silence growing into shape. Her belly had not yet begun to swell, but her dreams had, and in every dream, the face of the child was faceless. Outside, voices hummed from the courtyard, laughter tangled with drunken slurs, pitchers clinking. In this house, joy and agony always walked arm in arm. One girl wept for what she lost, while another laughed at a jest from a man who'd forget her name by morning. It was safer not to dream here, but tonight, she could not stop herself from dreaming. She remembered her mother once saying that Tauret stood between the world of the living and the unknown waters beyond. She was no noble deity with temples and priests, but a humble protector, one who saw women others ignored. Perhaps that was why she whispered now, not to Ra in the heavens or Osiris in the shadows, but to the thick-bodied mother guardian with crocodile tail and lion's feet. She had seen many girls bleed and weep and survive, and some who did not. The midwives who came to the house were women of few words and steady hands. They carried herbs and rough cloth, but not always comfort. Sometimes the prayers worked. Sometimes nothing did. The girl prayed because she didn't know what else could. Each time she touched her stomach, she felt panic rise like bile. Would this be a blessing or a curse shaped like a heartbeat? She had seen both outcomes. Some girls found strength in motherhood, forged new paths, left the house behind. Others were swallowed whole, their lives shortened to serve another. She did not know which road was hers. There were rules, unspoken but strict. If the pregnancy showed, the madame would choose, either hide her or send her away. There was no midground. This house thrived on illusion's soft skin, clean lines, no wrinkles of responsibility. A swollen belly did not bring coins, it brought shame, risk, and choices too cruel to name. She had heard stories of women who buried herbs beneath the doorpost to protect themselves and their unborn. She had no garden, no soil, but she rubbed sage across the wooden frame anyway, just to feel like she was doing something. She whispered her prayer each time, a threadbare mantra stitched from desperation. Tauret, be my door. Some girls feared men, some feared hunger. She feared the moment she would have to decide, to keep or to cut away. She loved the idea of a child, but not the world it would enter. How could she protect someone when she could not protect herself? Could love shield a child from the harshness of sand and coin? Tauret's eyes were carved wide open. They did not blink, did not judge. The girl stared back, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. "I am not ready," she told the goddess, "but I do not want to destroy what I do not yet understand." Her voice cracked, as though speaking was betrayal. But silence had betrayed her more. Her hands moved to her belly again, fingers tentative, like touching a wound. The house was never quiet, but in this moment, she heard nothing but her own breathing and the whisper of her own heart, both faster than normal. It was a rhythm of fear and hope woven tight. A tiny knock echoed at her door. She did not answer. It could be a client, or one of the younger girls. It didn't matter. She needed no witnesses tonight. She blew out the candle and curled herself tighter, the statue still pressed to her chest. In the darkness, her thoughts wandered deeper. She thought of the river, the Nile, the giver and taker. Some believed that when a woman gave birth, she crossed the spiritual Nile, carried by Toret. She wondered how many times she had crossed it in her sleep, unknowingly preparing for this moment. Or perhaps she was already in the river, and the banks were slipping away. There was a time she would have danced barefoot in a courtyard, sunlight catching her laughter. Now, every joy came twisted with consequence. She had not asked for this life, but she had survived it, and survival had become her prayer, her temple, her song. Toret, she whispered, "If I am to bear this child, let me do so with hands that do not tremble. Let me bring them into a world that has something gentle in it, even if it is only me." The goddess, mute and squat, offered no answer, but the girl felt a sliver of stillness bloom in her chest. She remembered a woman once who had given birth in silence, teeth clenched, no midwife near. Afterward, she had sung lullabies in a tongue none of them recognized, and the baby had stared up as if remembering a life before this one. That memory came now, soft and painful. She traced the grooves on Toret's back with the tip of her nail, wondering how many other women had held this same shape, whispered these same words. Were they all alone too, yet somehow together across time? A line of prayer held together by stone and hope. Somewhere in the house, a pitcher shattered, and a man shouted. The world had returned. But in her room, darkness still held her gently. She kissed the statue's head and tucked it beneath her sleeping mat. "You are my secret," she said, "my shield." She lay down and pulled the thin sheet over her shoulder. The air had cooled. Her hand lingered again on her belly, no longer with fear, but with mourning for the certainty she'd never have. The future would come. She only hoped it would not take everything. In the quiet that followed, she sang softly, not for herself, not for the house, for the heartbeat she was not yet sure was real. The song had no words, only hums, like a cradle, swaying slowly beneath stars. She hoped Toret was listening. The heat did not end with sunset. It only turned from flame to breath, heavy and thick as a blanket laid over the city. In the alleys of Thebes and the silent corridors of the lesser brothels, death walked as quietly as a lover slipping out before dawn. She could not be seen, but she lingered near, and the women of the house of beer knew her scent better than that of myrrh, blood, and old clay. They did not fear death in the way priests taught. There was no dignity in the endings they imagined, no procession of gold and linen, no chanting in temples with offerings left beneath the gods' statues. The women who gave their lives to softness and sin were not promised the book of the dead. They were forgotten, but death did not forget them. Some passed in silence, curled on worn mats in back rooms, their breath fading beneath the sound of laughter or music or coin being counted. There were no last rites, only whispered prayers from the others who dared not speak too loudly. If the house lost one, another would soon replace her. Life moved forward, but death never turned its face away. One girl had fallen ill and wasted slowly, her skin graying like the stone jars that lined the courtyard walls. The others brought her water and held her when she wept, but none called. A healer. Healers asked questions. Questions brought attention, and attention ruined business. So she died beneath her blanket, eyes open to the ceiling, whispering her mother's name. Another girl was found in the Nile, her wrists still clutched around a reed necklace she wore always, even with clients. No one retrieved the body. The river gave and took as it pleased. They said she had run away and tripped on stones, but all knew better. She had feared a man with a red sash, and he had come back angry. Still, her name was never spoken again. Death wore many faces in their world. It could come quickly, by blade or blow, or slowly, in the form of rot in the lungs, or the soft madness that crept in after years of pretending love for men who paid to forget their wives. The body bent under years of being chosen, touched, then discarded, and when it broke, it did, so quietly. One woman had danced too long, her knees finally refusing to hold her. When she collapsed, the others gathered around her, but the madam waved them off. Let her rest, she is of no use now. That night, they fed her dried figs and honey, the only sweetness they could afford. She died 2 days later, her last words a joke, too bitter to laugh at. There was no burial, just a wrapping in a faded sheet, and a man paid with 2 loaves to carry her away. Where to? No one asked. The gods, they hoped, would not be cruel enough to look away. But they also knew the truth. The gods were not built for women like them. They were built for pharaohs, for warriors, for wives, not for sellers of dreams. And yet, some women left small offerings anyway. A bit of coal in a cracked bowl, a lock of hair, a half-burned incense stick stolen from the priest's stalls. They hoped wildly that even if the world did not see them, the dead might. In the corner of the room, beneath a loose tile, they kept a small shrine. It was not grand, just a flat rock with 3 figures carved into it, kiss, Tauret, and a nameless woman drawn with breasts and arms open. They called her Mother of Dust. When one of them died, the others lit oil and placed a ribbon beside her figure. The shrine grew crowded. Each woman carried the memory of another within her, faces and laughter and cries. The stories were not written in ink or chiseled in stone. They lived in glances, scars, and in the way the survivors braided their hair a little tighter the next morning. They learned from the dead, and they walked for them. Some of the city's noblemen believed these women were cursed, that the ones who died early paid for their sins. But the women knew better. They had sinned no more than the men who paid them. The difference was only in the price. One paid in coin, the other in body and silence. Sometimes, they spoke of what kind of afterlife might welcome them. They laughed when they imagined a paradise filled, not with golden fields but with soft mats, endless figs, water without poison, and a place where no one touched them without love. That's where I'll be, one girl said before she fell asleep for the last time, waiting for you, all of you. The others had painted her eyes with kohl and placed blue lotus petals on her chest before she was taken away. It felt right, it felt sacred, and even if the world never knew her name, they would remember her hands, her laughter, her tenderness. That, at least, would not die. Death was not something they feared, it was something they expected. But even in that expectation, they rebelled. They wore bright beads, they sang dirty songs, they danced with wild abandon. To die having lived fully, even if only in shadows, was its own kind of defiance. Sometimes, when a new girl arrived, she was warned not about the clients or the rules, but about the ghosts. They walk here, one of the older women whispered. They linger, they sit beside us when we comb our hair. They listen when we cry, they remember us. The new girls laughed, but some came to believe. The dead women were not gone. They were stories and echoes in the walls, names scratched under beds, perfumes that never fully faded. They lingered in dreams and warnings, in the rhythm of footsteps on cold stone, in the hush before the door opened and a stranger stepped. One girl used to hum lullabies. She claimed she learned from a woman who died a year before she arrived. She sings to me, she said, every night. The others laughed, but they stopped when the girl began dreaming names she'd never heard before, names of women who had vanished long ago. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of their world. They had no tombs, no scrolls, no monuments. But their memory found other ways to live, through whispers, through grief, through the undying ache of women who refused to forget one another. The priest who passed by once a month with blessings and warnings never looked them in the eye. He mumbled his verses and sprinkled water that quickly dried in the sun. He didn't know their names, he never asked, but the dead did. The dead remembered. So when the sun dipped below the edge of the walls and the last call of the ibis echoed into silence, the women lit their candles. They whispered names, not real names, perhaps, but sacred ones, names meant only for the dead. And in those moments, the world grew still, and death, for once, bowed its head. The walls of the house of beer were neither grand nor ancient, yet they remembered. In the mortar between their bricks, voices had gathered like the scent of old oils lingering, refusing to fade. The laughter, the weeping, the breathless moans, of transaction and need, all had soaked into the clay. And if one listened in silence, long enough, without fear, the stone would whisper back. In the early morning, Before the city began its stretch and yawn, a stillness settled over the rooms. The girls, asleep or pretending to be, left no sound. But the walls murmured. They recalled feet rushing across dirt floors, a broken cup against the corner, the low hum of a song hummed by a girl with salt on her lashes. These were not memories of glory, but they were alive. No one built monuments for women like them. Their names weren't chiseled into temples or listed in the ledgers of scribes, but they had left marks as smudges of pigment where one leaned too long near the mirror. A nail scratch behind the bed frame, a painted eye on a broken shard of pottery buried in the dust. Their stories survived in fragments. A newcomer once traced her fingers along a carved lotus on a low pillar and asked, "Who did this?" The madame replied, "One of the gone ones." She thought it would make the place prettier. The flower had long since dulled to grey, but it pulsed with something more than just forgotten artistry. It was a voice, frozen in bloom. Some stones groaned in the heat, expanding as if trying to stretch themselves back into form. Others whispered at night when the oil lamps flickered. Cracks formed near corners where too many secrets had been buried. The girls joked about ghosts, but only half in jest. They felt watched, and not always by men. The floor beneath the fourth room dipped ever so slightly, worn down by years of pacing nervous steps before a client, a habit of a girl who couldn't sleep unless she moved. No one remembered her name, but her rhythm remained. Sometimes, another would find herself pacing too, not knowing why. Following a groove etched in time, the house, like the women inside it, bore scars it did not speak of. There was a small scorch mark near the back window, once a curtain caught fire during a fight. A girl had thrown perfume oil in rage, and the flame had leaped. It was put out quickly, but the black mark stayed, a shadow of fury and fear. Even laughter left its trace. A crack near the roofline spread like a grin, shaped oddly like the open mouth of a girl who laughed too loudly. Even when she cried after, the others said she was mad. Or maybe she was the only one sane enough to feel fully. She vanished one spring night. No one saw her go, but her laugh echoed still. Sometimes the walls remembered things the girls tried to forget. A bloodstain that never quite washed out. A dark spot beneath a mat where someone had wept all night. Whispers of threats made through clenched teeth. The stone did not judge. It simply held everything. In a narrow hallway where sunlight never reached, a girl once pressed her cheek to the cold stone and whispered her lover's name. He never came back, but others claimed they heard her voice there, even after she had gone, murmuring the same syllables like a chant. The hallway was never quiet again. Not all memories were sad. Some were warm like the faint scent of rose oil that lingered years after a girl who always wore it left the house. She had once painted the edge of a doorway with her finger, marking her space. That edge still gleamed in morning light, stubborn in its shimmer. The women began to see the house not as a prison, but as a witness. It had seen them whole, not dressed. For others, not postured in seduction, but barefoot and undone, mouths full of bread, tears streaking through laughter. It had seen their becoming and their breaking, and it remembered without malice. One girl kept a tiny bit of ochre in a hidden crack behind her bed. "For when I'm gone," she said, "so they know I was beautiful once." She smeared it on the stone once a week, just a fingertip's worth. Years later, the smear still pulsed red when the light hit just right. There was a room they no longer used. Too many had died there. One during childbirth, another from sickness, a third simply stopped waking. It had been cleaned, scrubbed, blessed, and left empty. Yet the stone hummed low, like breath caught in a throat. No one entered unless they had to. The madame herself once sat alone at dusk, her hand resting on the wall. She was older than the rest, and had lived there the longest. "It's not just stone," she said. "It's a sponge. It keeps everything. We give it." Then she laughed bitterly. "And we give it everything." The windows had lines etched in the sill-stallies, perhaps, or symbols meant only for the women who had made them. Some were straight, others curved like snakes or tears. A secret language left behind. No one understood them fully, but they were never removed. During floods, the water rose to the knees in the lower rooms. Mud crept up the walls. But when it dried, the house remained, as if defying the Nile itself. The women scraped the silt away and sang as they did it, their voices rising against stone that refused to crumble. The plaster on one wall flaked away in the shape of a bird. They left it untouched. She flew away, they said, of a girl who had disappeared one night without a word. They did not speak of where she went, or how, but the image remained delicate, winged, impossible. When visitors came, men with coin and quick breath, they never noticed the house's soul. They looked at bodies, not spaces. But the girls knew. They touched the walls when they felt alone. They pressed against the stone when their hearts ached. And sometimes the house responded, holding warmth a moment too long. One night, thunder rolled across the sky, and a bolt struck near the house. It shook, the walls shivering like a frightened beast. In that instant, every girl awoke. They looked at each other, breathless, certain they had heard a voice not from the storm, but from the stone itself. It had cried out. They began to leave offerings, not just to gods, but to the house. A ribbon here, a flower there, bits of food, pieces of themselves, given freely. The stone accepted all without condition. It did not demand purity or penance, only truth. They began telling stories to the walls. Before sleep, they spoke aloud, confessions, dreams, old wounds. The walls held each one, never speaking back, never judging, just remembering. And over time, the girls grew less afraid of being forgotten, because they knew, in the end, the house would hold them, not in gold or scroll, but in grooves, scents, and stains, in silence thick with history, in the places their fingers had lingered, in the spaces where they had danced, in the stone that did not forget.